In the small towns around Manchester, England, people thought they were lucky. Their local GP, Dr. Harold Shipman, was everything a patient could want. Friendly, calm, always available. He dressed neatly, had a reassuring voice, and made house calls. To the elderly, he was more than just a doctor. He was a companion. He asked about their families, remembered their birthdays, and always seemed genuinely interested in their lives. His manner was quiet and professional, but there was warmth behind his words. He didn't rush patients the way other doctors did. He sat, he listened, and he made them feel safe. If your grandmother wasn't feeling well, you called Dr. Shipman. If your father needed checkups, Dr. Shipman would come by with his little black medical bag. That bag, filled with vials, syringes, and stethoscopes, became a familiar sight in living rooms across the north of England. People associated it with comfort, relief, and healing. To everyone, he wasn't just a doctor, he was a savior. But beneath that calm, reassuring smile was something absolutely horrifying. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. His patients were older, many in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. So when they passed away, it was rarely questioned. Dr. Shipman would be the one at the scene, calmly explaining the cause of death. He would comfort grieving families, saying it was peaceful and painless. He'd even handle the paperwork, signing the death certificates himself. That last detail, that he was both the attending physician and the one certifying deaths, meant nobody looked too closely. He was trusted, respected, even admired. The perfect cover. In the 1970s, Shipman's career had already shown cracks, but people forgot. Early on, he became addicted to pethidine, a painkiller. He forged prescriptions to feed his habit. He was caught, fined, and briefly sent to rehab. Any other doctor would have had their career destroyed, but somehow, Shipman managed to bounce back. He kept practicing, rebuilding his image brick by brick until nobody remembered the scandal. By the 1980s, his reputation was untouchable. Patients recommended him to friends. Families called him the most dedicated doctor they'd ever had. And behind closed doors, bodies quietly piled up. The deaths followed a strange pattern, but it was subtle. Many of his patients died suddenly, sometimes during or right after visits. One moment, they were alive and chatting with their doctor. The next, they were slumped in their chairs, gone. Shipman always had an explanation. Heart failure, stroke, natural causes. But there was something chilling about the way it happened. Neighbors began whispering, years later, that Shipman always seemed to be around when someone died. And the deaths were almost too peaceful. No struggles, no warning signs, just quiet, sudden endings. Still, nobody suspected him. Because why would they? He was Dr. Shipman, the kind, reliable doctor who had delivered babies, treated illnesses, and comforted the sick for decades. For Shipman, the routine became disturbingly simple. He would visit an elderly patient, often alone, carrying his black bag. Inside were powerful drugs, most often morphine or geomorphine. He'd administer an injection, saying it would help with pain or calm their nerves. Within minutes, the patient would slip away. Then, Shipman would call the family, explain the death as natural, and sign off the paperwork. If cremation was chosen, as he often encouraged, any trace of the drug was destroyed forever. No investigation, no suspicion, just another quiet death in a small English town. The families trusted him so deeply that they didn't question even the strangest circumstances. In fact, some even thanked him for being there during their loved ones' final moments. That trust, that misplaced gratitude, was the very thing Shipman exploited over and over again. Behind the image of the perfect GP was a man playing God with people's lives. He decided who lived, who died, and when. The elderly, Those who were most vulnerable and most trusting were his chosen victims. And the chilling part, nobody realized. Not the families, not the hospitals, not the police. For decades, he operated in plain sight. Shipman wasn't just a doctor. He was the shadow that lingered in living rooms across Manchester, a presence that seemed reassuring at first glance, yet was slowly, systematically erasing lives, one patient at a time. And soon, his dark secret would begin to unravel. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, one strange thing started happening in the towns where Harold Shipman practiced. His patients kept dying, but not in a violent, suspicious way. These were mostly elderly people, men and women who had lived long, quiet lives. They were often found peacefully sitting in their favorite armchairs or lying on the couch, as if they had simply dozed off and never woken up. It almost looked merciful, like nature had granted them a painless end. Families grieved, but they didn't question it. Why would they? Their loved ones had been under the care of one of the most respected doctors in the region. Dr. Shipman was often the first person to arrive at the scene. He would walk in with his black medical bag, check for a pulse, and then lower his eyes with that calm, practiced sympathy. "Your mother has passed peacefully," he would say, in his soft, measured tone. There was no pain. He reassured families at their most vulnerable moment. And because he was the doctor, nobody thought to doubt him. Afterward, he'd handle the paperwork himself. He would fill in the death certificate, list a natural cause, stroke, heart failure, respiratory collapse. His word was law. No code in it out of you. No hospital challenged him. And since so many of these patients were elderly, nobody expected an autopsy. It was neat, clean, final. And just like that, another death vanished into the background noise of everyday life. Over the years, this pattern repeated itself again and again. The strange thing was how sudden these deaths were. Many patients had been in stable health, frail perhaps, but not terminal. Some are even described by family members as being perfectly fine hours before Shipman's visit. Yet almost immediately afterward, they were gone. Neighbors noticed, but only in hindsight. They recalled how often ambulances would show up at homes shortly after Shipman's black car pulled into the drive. How many times it happened just after one of his routine visits. But at the time, nobody connected the dots. Why? Because death, especially of the elderly, was expected. It blended into the rhythm of small-town life. 1 week, a funeral. The next week, another. Each one sad, but never alarming. And that was Shipman's camouflage. The families trusted him so completely that they didn't just accept his explanations. They often thanked him. Many later admitted they were grateful that he had been there to ease their loved one's passing. They believed he had offered comfort at the very end. In some cases, relatives described feeling reassured by the way he handled death, as though he had given them closure. What they didn't realize was that Shipman wasn't easing suffering. He was causing it. The truth was, Harold Shipman had started playing God. With his access to lethal doses of morphine and diamorphine, he could decide who lived, who died, and exactly when. For him, it was easy, too easy. He would inject the drug under the guise of treatment, just something to help with the pain. Minutes later, the patient would slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. To the untrained eye, it looked natural, peaceful, but it wasn't nature, it was murder. And here's the most chilling detail. In many cases, Shipman would stay behind afterward. Sometimes he lingered in the home, sipping tea with grieving relatives, calmly chatting as though nothing unusual had happened. Other times, he left quickly, leaving families to discover the body minutes later, forcing them to call him back, at which point he would return, feign surprise, and then pronounce the death. Imagine that, the very man responsible for the death being the one who announced it. The killer standing in the living room, pretending to be the hero. By the mid-1980s, Shipman's patient list had become a graveyard. His death rates were abnormally high compared to other doctors in the area. But medicine is a profession where numbers can blur. People get sick, people die, and unless someone takes the time to compare data across practices, nobody notices. Back then, nobody did. And so, case after case was chalked up as old age or bad luck. No one raised an eyebrow. But beneath the surface, something monstrous was happening. Dr. Shipman had discovered the perfect method of killing. Silent, undetectable, and hidden under the cover of trust. No one questioned him. No one doubted him. And what people didn't realize was that this calm, trusted man was quietly choosing who would live and who would die. By the 1990s, the death toll around Harold Shipman had climbed shockingly high. Hundreds of patients had quietly passed under his care. Yet somehow, no one was putting it together. His reputation as a caring, reliable doctor was still intact. But all of that began to unravel in 1998, when a single death broke the illusion. Her name was Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen wasn't just another elderly woman in Hyde, the town where Shipman practiced. She was known across the community. Elegant, proper, and sharp as a tack, even at the age of 81. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had once been mayor. She was deeply involved in local charities, always lending her time and resources to improve the lives of others. Friends admired her independence. She still dressed impeccably, managed her own affairs, and kept an active social calendar. Neighbors recalled seeing her out walking or attending events, a woman full of energy and not at all frail. So when she died suddenly, under the care of her trusted doctor, people were stunned. Yes, she was elderly, but Kathleen wasn't at death's door. She wasn't bedridden. She wasn't seriously ill. Still, when Dr. Shipman gently explained to the family that she had passed peacefully, they accepted it. After all, this was Harold Shipman. If he said it was natural, it must have been. But within weeks, something surfaced that shattered that illusion. After Kathleen's funeral, her daughter, Angela Woodruff, received legal paperwork regarding her mother's will. Angela was a solicitor, a lawyer, and she knew every detail of her mother's estate. She also knew her mother personally, organized, careful, and absolutely devoted to her family. The will Angela received, however, was bizarre. The language was clunky, riddled with grammatical errors and awkward phrasing. It didn't resemble Kathleen's precise, educated voice. But the real shock was buried in the contents. Instead of leaving her wealth, nearly £400,000, to her children and grandchildren, the entire estate was left to one man, Dr. Harold Shipman. Angela was stunned. Her mother had never hinted at such an idea. Yes, she liked her doctor, but leave him everything? That didn't sound like her at all. Angela later said the will was so badly drafted it was almost laughable. But what wasn't laughable was the implication. If this will was genuine, Angela and her family were completely cut out. If it was fake, then someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it looked real. And if her mother hadn't truly died of natural causes, then the man who forged this document might also be a murderer. Angela's instincts as both a lawyer and a daughter screamed that something was terribly wrong. She took the will to the police. At first, detectives hesitated. The accused wasn't some shady stranger. He was Dr. Shipman, one of the most respected men in town. To accuse him of forgery was bold. To accuse him of killing a patient, that was nearly unthinkable. But Angela was insistent. She knew her mother, and she knew this document wasn't hers. Detectives agreed to take a closer look. They quietly began investigating Shipman. They interviewed him about the will. Shipman, ever the cool professional, barely blinked. He claimed Kathleen had wanted to reward him for years of dedicated service. He acted casual, dismissive, almost insulted by the accusation. His confidence was disarming. He had spent years perfecting the mask of the trustworthy doctor. Some officers were almost convinced by his composure. But one detail gnawed at them. Why would a wealthy, meticulous woman suddenly change her will in such a sloppy, obvious way? So they decided to take the most dramatic step possible. They obtained permission to exhume Kathleen Grundy's body. On a gray day, her coffin was lifted from the ground and taken for forensic analysis. Scientists ran toxicology tests, searching for anything unusual. What they found blew the case wide open. Kathleen's body contained high levels of morphine, not a therapeutic amount, not something that could be explained away by pain management. It was a lethal dose, enough to kill. This wasn't a peaceful, natural passing. It wasn't heart failure. It wasn't old age. It was a deliberate injection. And the only man who had been with her at the time of death, the only man with access to those drugs, was Harold Shipman. For the first time in decades, Shipman's perfect mask cracked. He had been so careful, so methodical. He chose elderly victims whose deaths would attract little suspicion. He discouraged autopsies, encouraged cremation, and signed off the paperwork himself. For years, his plan had worked flawlessly, but this time, greed got the better of him. By trying to seize Kathleen's fortune, he left behind a trail of evidence. A forged will, a suspicious daughter, and, most damning of all, the drugs in Kathleen's veins. This single mistake, this one act of arrogance, was enough to expose everything. The perfect doctor had just made his first mistake, and that mistake was about to bring his entire empire of death crashing down. After Kathleen Grundy's death revealed morphine in her system, the police finally had proof that Dr. Harold Shipman wasn't the trusted family doctor everyone believed him to be. He was a killer, but the question now was terrifying. How many victims were there? Detectives started to dig into Shipman's patient history. At first, they assumed there might be one or two other suspicious deaths. But what they found shattered any sense of normalcy. They saw a pattern that was almost impossible to ignore. Elderly patients, often perfectly capable the day before, were dying suddenly and inexplicably. Shipman was always present, always in control. He pronounced the death, signed the certificate, reassured the family, and quietly moved on to the next house call. Then came another chilling pattern: cremations. Shipman consistently urged families to cremate their loved ones quickly. He framed it as a kindness, an easy way to relieve families of the burden. Grieving relatives, trusting the doctor they had known for decades, rarely questioned him. And in doing so, the evidence of what had actually killed their loved ones disappeared forever. It was an act of methodical genius in its cruelty. In plain sight, Shipman created the perfect shield. No bodies, no autopsies, no questions. Investigators managed to exhume the rare cases where the bodies had not yet been cremated. Time after time, the results were horrifying. Lethal doses of morphine or geomorphine were found in patients who should have had no reason to receive such drugs. It was clear now, this was not a string of tragic coincidences. It wasn't natural causes. It was systematic, deliberate murder. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. Shipman's death rates far exceeded those of any other local physician. While most GPs might see 70 to 80 patients pass away over a decade, Shipman's patient deaths were double, triple, sometimes 4 times that. Authorities eventually estimated that he had murdered over 250 patients, 250 individuals, entire families destroyed, friends and neighbors left grieving, confused, and devastated, never suspecting that the man who had delivered comfort to their loved ones was actually the architect of their deaths. Shipman's method was horrifyingly consistent. He would visit an elderly patient under the guise of routine care. Calm, reassuring, professional, he would explain that he had something to ease pain or help them rest. Then, with one syringe, He would inject a lethal dose of morphine directly into their veins. Within minutes, the patient would die. Minutes. And then he would step back, perfectly composed, and deliver the news to the family. "I'm afraid they've passed." The words, calm and precise, were designed to remove suspicion. Families leaned on him for answers, and he gave them exactly what they wanted to hear: natural causes. Peaceful, unavoidable. And then he signed the death certificate. If burial was requested, Shipman would gently steer the family toward cremation. And just like that, every trace of wrongdoing was gone. The ultimate crime hidden behind a veil of compassion. For decades, he thrived on trust. Families were grateful for the comfort he provided at the most devastating moments of their lives. They didn't suspect that his hands, so gentle in appearance, were the same ones delivering death. They hugged him, they thanked him, they mourned alongside him. The psychological horror of this truth is staggering. Imagine realizing years later that the person you believed was protecting your loved ones was the very reason they were gone. Imagine entire generations lost at the hands of someone you invited into your home, someone who wore a white coat and stethoscope-like armor. When the full scale of Shipman's crimes became public, the world was stunned. Serial killers often have one, maybe a dozen victims, but hundreds? It was almost incomprehensible. And yet there it was, the quiet, respectable doctor, tidy suit, calm voice, and neat handwriting, systematically wiping out hundreds of lives in plain sight. Mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers wiped out under the guise of care and kindness. Forensic investigators, overwhelmed by the scale, worked tirelessly to piece together the pattern. Each death certificate, each cremation request, each patient record was combed for anomalies. Slowly, a terrifying picture emerged. Shipman wasn't just a serial killer. He was the most prolific modern-day serial killer in history. But the unraveling didn't stop there. Families, journalists, and investigators started to tell stories. The daughter who noticed her mother's will had been changed. The neighbor who remembered a doctor's suspiciously frequent visits. The local pharmacist who noticed repeated morphine prescriptions. Piece by piece, the facade shattered. Shipman had been living a double life. By day, a doctor providing comfort. By night, or in those quiet moments in living rooms across Hyde and surrounding towns, a man deciding who would live and who would die. By the late 1990s, the truth was undeniable. Harold Shipman wasn't just a fraud. He wasn't just a killer. He was something far more sinister. The architect of mass murder, hiding in plain sight in the very profession society trusted most. And with each new discovery, the empire he had built on death began to collapse completely. In 2000, after years of investigation, Harold Shipman finally faced justice. The trial was one of the most extraordinary in British history, not just because of the number of victims, but because of the horror hidden behind the mask of a trusted family doctor. Shipman was charged with 15 murders, all meticulously documented and supported by evidence, including toxicology reports and witness testimonies from suspicious relatives. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had spent decades exploiting trust, medical knowledge, and authority to commit murder with chilling efficiency. Inside the courtroom, the public watched in disbelief. Shipman, calm and collected in the witness box, displayed the same unnerving composure he had used for decades to reassure families. There was no hint of remorse, no sign of guilt, just a quiet, almost clinical detachment. To those in the room, it was as if he were still diagnosing patients, still deciding life or death with the ease of a professional, still behind the mask he had perfected. The prosecution painstakingly outlined his methods. They showed how he had chosen his victims, mostly elderly, and unsuspecting. How he had injected lethal doses of diamorphine under the guise of treatment. How he had falsified medical records and encouraged cremation to destroy evidence. They detailed his greed, his manipulation of wills, and the sheer audacity of his crimes, killing hundreds while enjoying the respect of an entire community. Shipman's defense tried to claim that the deaths were natural or coincidental. They argued that the evidence could be circumstantial, but the numbers told a story that could not be ignored. Shipman's patient death rate was off the charts compared to any other GP. Toxicology confirmed lethal doses of morphine in exhumed bodies. The forged will of Kathleen Grundy and the testimony of her daughter Angela sealed the argument. This was no accident. This was deliberate, calculated murder. After a trial that gripped the nation, Shipman was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he never be released. Justice finally had caught up to him, but investigators and the public knew the grim truth. The 15 murders for which he was convicted were only the tip of the iceberg. Estimates of his true death toll were staggering: over 250 victims. Entire lives erased, families destroyed, all hidden behind a veneer of trust and professionalism. For decades, Shipman had been able to wield death like a scalpel, cutting lives short with methodical precision. For the families, the reality was unthinkable. Those who had trusted Shipman completely, who had invited him into their homes, confided in him, leaned on him during the most intimate and vulnerable moments of life, were left with the unbearable truth. The man who had promised to care for them and their loved ones had instead been orchestrating death. Their healer had been a predator. Shipman entered prison as a convicted murderer, but even behind bars, the darkness followed him. He spent his time reading medical journals, playing cards, and maintaining a detached routine, almost as if nothing had changed. He reportedly refused to discuss his victims and offered no explanation for his actions. Then, in January 2004, the world learned that Harold Shipman had died in his prison cell. He had taken his own life. The news shocked many. Some thought it was fitting poetic justice. Others were disturbed by the fact that he had escaped the full weight of accountability in the only way left: by controlling his own death. Even in death, Shipman left behind unanswered questions. Psychologists, criminologists, and journalists have debated for years. Why did he do it? Was it a thirst for power? The ability to decide life and death for others? Was it control? A compulsion that gave him dominance over families, communities, and the fragile elderly? Or was it something darker, something psychological that even experts could not fully understand? There are no easy answers. Shipman left no confessions, no diaries, no explanations beyond the cold facts of his crimes. The people who might have had closure were left only with grief, shock, and anger. Today, Harold Shipman is not remembered as the trusted physician he once appeared to be. He is remembered as the Doctor of Death. His name is synonymous with betrayal, horror, and one of the most chilling examples of how someone can hide pure evil behind a mask of normalcy. His crimes led to profound changes in British medicine. Stricter regulations were put in place to prevent doctors from being able to sign off on deaths without oversight. Death certificates were scrutinized more carefully. Cremations, once routine, came under greater review. In a sense, Shipman's reign of terror reshaped an entire system of care to prevent future tragedies. But no regulation, no procedure could undo the personal devastation. Hundreds of families still grieve loved ones who were stolen from them. Neighbors and communities still struggle to reconcile the image of the calm, kind doctor with the horrifying reality of his crimes. The story of Harold Shipman remains a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that evil can wear a familiar face. It can live in a trusted home, a white coat, a soothing voice. It can hide in plain sight, preying on trust, innocence, and vulnerability. And it shows that sometimes the people we rely on the most, the ones we invite into our lives at the most intimate moments, can be the very ones capable of unimaginable harm. Harold Shipman is gone, but the shadow of his crimes lingers. The question remains, how many lives could one trusted man truly destroy before anyone saw it coming? And in the quiet towns around Manchester, that question still haunts the memories of those who once thought their doctor was a friend, a healer, a protector. In the 1970s and 80s, at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, something unspeakable was happening behind closed doors. To neighbors, Fred and Rose West seemed like an ordinary couple raising a big family. The house was noisy, cramped, full of children. But beneath the chaos of family life was a horror so disturbing it would shock the nation. Fred West was already known to police before he ever met Rose. Born in 1941, he grew up in rural poverty, one of 9 children, in a household plagued by secrecy and dysfunction. His childhood was marked by instability and troubling influences. He left school barely literate, took up odd jobs, and quickly developed a reputation for stealing, fighting, and having an unhealthy fascination with control. By his late teens, Fred had already shown dangerous tendencies. In 1961, he suffered a near-fatal motorcycle accident that left him with permanent head injuries. Many believe this worsened his lack of restraint and judgment. Not long after, he was caught in troubling behavior with young women, and by the time he met Rose, let's in the late 1960s, Fred West was already deeply disturbed. Rose, by contrast, was still a child when their paths crossed. She was born in 1953, 12 years younger than Fred, and grew up in a home that was also unstable and deeply troubled. When she met Fred, she was just a teenager. Instead of walking away from his volatility, she gravitated toward him. By 16, she had moved in with him, becoming not only his partner, but eventually his collaborator. From the beginning, their relationship was steeped in control. Rose quickly took over as stepmother to Fred's children from a previous relationship, but she was not the caring figure they needed. Neighbors began to notice her temper, and the children often appeared anxious and fearful. Fred encouraged her harsh discipline rather than stopping it. Their house was turning into a place of fear, and then it escalated. The first suspected victim of the West together was Fred's own stepdaughter, 8-year-old Charmaine. When Fred was briefly imprisoned in 1971, Rose was left to care for the children. During that time, Charmaine vanished. Rose told people the girl had gone to live with her mother. But years later, investigators discovered Charmaine's remains buried near the property, ending the mystery of her disappearance. Not long after, Fred's estranged wife, Rena, Charmaine's mother, also disappeared. Her body was later found in a nearby field. 2 lives had ended in quick succession, and no one at the time connected the dots. When Fred and Rose finally settled at 25 Cromwell Street in 1972, they had found the perfect place to continue their crimes. The house was old and poorly maintained, with multiple rooms for lodgers. It was close to bus routes, schools, and busy streets where young people passed through. And most importantly, it had a cellar and a garden, hidden spaces where secrets could be concealed. In the 1970s and 80s, at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, something unspeakable was happening behind closed doors. To neighbors, Fred and Rose West seemed like an ordinary couple raising a big family. The house was noisy, cramped, full of children. But beneath the chaos of family life was a horror so disturbing it would shock the nation. Fred West was already known to police before he ever met Rose. Born in 1941, he grew up in rural poverty, one of 9 children, in a household plagued by secrecy and dysfunction. His childhood was marked by instability and troubling influences. He left school barely literate, took up odd jobs, and quickly developed a reputation for stealing, fighting, and having an unhealthy fascination with control. By his late teens, Fred had already shown dangerous tendencies. In 1961, he suffered a near-fatal motorcycle accident that left him with permanent head injuries. Many believe this worsened his lack of restraint and judgment. Not long after, he was caught in troubling behavior with young women, and by the time he met Rose, let's in the late 1960s, Fred West was already deeply disturbed. Rose, by contrast, was still a child when their paths crossed. She was born in 1953, 12 years younger than Fred, and grew up in a home that was also unstable and deeply troubled. When she met Fred, she was just a teenager. Instead of walking away from his volatility, she gravitated toward it. By 16, she had moved in with him, becoming not only his partner, but eventually his collaborator. From the beginning, their relationship was steeped in control. Rose quickly took over as stepmother to Fred's children from a previous relationship, but she was not the caring figure they needed. Neighbors began to notice her temper, and the children often appeared anxious and fearful. Fred encouraged her harsh discipline rather than stopping it. Their house was turning into a place of fear, and then it escalated. The first suspected victim of the West together was Fred's own stepdaughter, 8-year-old Charmaine. When Fred was briefly imprisoned in 1971, Rose was left to care for the children. During that time, Charmaine vanished. Rose told people the girl had gone to live with her mother. But years later, investigators discovered Charmaine's remains buried near the property, ending the mystery of her disappearance. Not long after, Fred's estranged wife, Rena, Charmaine's mother, also disappeared. Her body was later found in a nearby field. 2 lives had ended in quick succession, and no one at the time connected the dots. When Fred and Rose finally settled at 25 Cromwell Street in 1972, they had found the perfect place to continue their crimes. The house was old and poorly maintained, with multiple rooms for lodgers. It was close to bus routes, schools, and busy streets where young people passed through. And most importantly, it had a cellar and a garden, hidden spaces where secrets could be concealed. The house was perfectly situated. It was large enough to rent out rooms, which brought in a steady stream of young lodgers, mostly women, often with nowhere else to go. It was close to bus routes and schools, making it easy to meet teenagers or runaways. And most importantly for Fred, it had both a cellar and a garden, hidden spaces where secrets could be concealed. From here, the disappearances began. The West would lure vulnerable young women into the house with promises of lodging, food, or companionship. But once inside, they were trapped. Victims would endure unimaginable cruelty before being permanently silenced. Their bodies were concealed beneath the floorboards, buried in shallow graves in the garden, or hidden in makeshift pits Fred dug into the cellar. In 1973, their cruelty escalated to shocking levels. Several young women vanished under mysterious circumstances after last being seen near Cromwell Street. Among them was 21-year-old Lucy Partington, a university student who disappeared while waiting for a bus in December 1973. She was intelligent, from a loving family, and completely unsuspecting of the danger she stepped into. Months later, her remains were discovered buried beneath the house. There was also 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard, who vanished in 1974 while on her way home from work. Her disappearance baffled police at the time. Years later, she too was found beneath Cromwell Street, and there are many others. Lodgers, hitchhikers, runaways. Vulnerable girls who crossed paths with the Wests and were never seen again. Each time, Fred had the same method. Silence them, hide the evidence, and then carry on as though nothing had happened. What's perhaps most disturbing is how ordinary life continued around the horror. While neighbors saw a chaotic but seemingly normal family, children playing in the yard, music blaring from the house, visitors coming and going, beneath the surface, Cromwell Street had become a secret graveyard. The West children grew up in this house of horrors. They often overheard muffled cries, banging noises, and strange sounds from the cellar. When they asked, Fred dismissed it with a chilling explanation. It's just the ghosts. The children believed him. This was the pattern for years. The house stayed lively, full of family life, but behind the locked doors and hidden floorboards, a series of tragedies was being buried, one after another. By the late 1970s, Cromwell Street had become infamous, though no one outside knew it yet. Friends and lodgers would come and go, some leaving abruptly, some vanishing entirely. And Fred and Rose seemed to thrive in the chaos, masking their darkness with noise, family drama, and constant activity. The truth wouldn't emerge for 2 more decades. But even before Cromwell Street became infamous, Fred West's trail of victims stretched back years. His first known kill, in McFall, was only the beginning. Rose had joined him in 1969, and together they created one of the most chilling partnerships in criminal history. By the mid-1970s, 25, Cromwell Street had become a nightmare disguised as an ordinary family home. To the outside world, Fred and Rose West presented themselves as noisy but harmless, a struggling couple raising a brood of children in a crowded terrace house. Neighbors often saw kids playing outside, heard arguments spilling into the street, and smelled food cooking from the upstairs windows. Nothing about the place suggested that behind its doors, one of the darkest chapters in British criminal history was unfolding. The reality was that Fred and Rose were continuing their cycle of killing. They often targeted young women who were on the margins of society, lodgers renting cheap rooms, girls who had run away from strict families, or teenagers who had argued with their parents. These victims were particularly vulnerable. They didn't have people constantly checking on them, and if they vanished, their absence could be brushed off as a choice to start fresh somewhere else. The West exploited this. They knew how to appear friendly, trustworthy, and accommodating. They offered food, a bed, companionship. But those promises were traps. One of the most haunting cases tied to them is that of Lucy Partington. Lucy was 21 years old, a bright and compassionate university student studying English literature. She came from a close, loving family, and her friends described her as thoughtful, intelligent, and deeply kind. On the night of December 27, 1973, Lucy was on her way home from visiting a friend in Cheltenham. She stopped at a bus stop, and then she was gone. For decades, her family clung to hope, searching for answers. It wasn't until 1994, when Cromwell Street was excavated, that the truth came out. Lucy's remains were found in the cellar of the house. Investigators believed she had been held captive for at least a short time before being killed. For her family, the discovery was devastating. But at least they finally had answers after more than 20 years of uncertainty. Another victim was Shirley Hubbard, a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Shirley lived in Droitwich, Worcestershire, and was last seen in November 1974, walking home from work at a plastics factory. She was shy but full of life, with dreams of independence. When she didn't return home, her disappearance baffled her family and police. Like so many others, her trail ended at Cromwell Street. Decades later, Her remains were found beneath the floorboards. Even hardened detectives were shaken by the condition in which she was discovered. Shirley had suffered cruelty no teenager should ever endure before being silenced. These weren't isolated incidents. Other young women, many of them lodgers at Cromwell Street, also disappeared during these years. Some were drawn in by cheap rent, others by the promise of food and shelter, still others by Fred's seemingly friendly nature. Once inside, they became trapped. Fred and Rose had perfected their facade. They could be charming to outsiders, blending into the community just enough to avoid suspicion. While at home, they ruled with fear and control. What's perhaps most chilling is how normal life continued alongside the violence. As women vanished, the West household bustled with children. Fred and Rose had several of their own, and Rose took in others to foster. To the outside world, it looked like a chaotic but ordinary family. Kids playing in the garden, visitors coming and going, endless noise from the house. But within those walls, the atmosphere was suffocating. Some of their children later testified that they overheard strange noises from the cellar at night. Muffled cries, thuds, or footsteps. When they asked about it, Fred would give a sinister explanation. It's just the ghosts. And the children, too young to understand, believed him. The cruelty wasn't limited to outsiders. Testimonies later revealed that Fred and Rose's own daughters endured years of mistreatment inside the household. Some were subjected to acts of control and violence. Others were forced to live with the psychological weight of knowing something was deeply wrong, but feeling powerless to stop it. As adults, several of the West children bravely testified against their parents, painting a picture of a home that was less a sanctuary and more prison. Through the mid-1970s and into the 1980s, this dual life continued. On one hand, the West appeared to be just another struggling family on a working-class street. On the other, Cromwell Street was becoming a burial ground. Victims were hidden in the garden, under the floorboards, or in shallow graves dug in the cellar. Fred, with his background in construction, knew exactly how to conceal them. What's staggering is how long they got away with it. Women vanished, families searched, police opened cases, and still, no one connected the disappearances to the house on Cromwell Street. In part, it was because the victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. Runaways, young lodgers, women without close family ties nearby. In the eyes of authorities at the time, these were people who might simply have moved on, but in reality, they hadn't moved anywhere. They were buried beneath the West's own floorboards. This was the grim paradox of Cromwell Street, a house that looked like a family home, alive with noise and children, but which was in fact a tomb. And as the years went on, the number of victims grew. Each time, Fred and Rose carried on as if nothing had happened, hiding their crimes in plain sight. For years, Fred and Rose West lived as though nothing could touch them. They had created a perfect cover, a busy household full of children, noise, and chaos. Their victims were almost always young women who had already slipped through society's cracks, runaways, estranged from family, or living transient lives. When they vanished, there were no dramatic manhunts or endless newspaper headlines. People just assumed they had started over somewhere new. And so the West kept operating in the shadows, shielded by timing and circumstance. This was the 1970s and 80s, long before modern DNA testing or nationwide databases that could easily link missing persons cases. Police departments often worked in isolation, each treating disappearances as standalone mysteries. That separation allowed Fred and Rose's trail of victims to remain unconnected, each case floating in limbo, never tied back to the same address in Boston. But by the early 1990s, cracks began to appear. The source wasn't outside suspicion. It was their own children. Life inside Cromwell Street was anything but normal, and the West kids knew it. They lived in constant fear of their parents' tempers. Some had endured treatment so cruel they struggled to process it. And when they confided in teachers or friends, whispers began to spread. Teachers noticed the strange comments. Social workers flagged concerns. Bit by bit, the carefully constructed facade around Cromwell Street started to crumble. In 1992, one of the West daughters bravely went to police. She described, in chilling detail, the abuse she and her siblings suffered at home. For investigators, it was a shocking account, not just of mistreatment, but of violence on a scale that suggested far darker secrets still hidden. Authorities immediately placed the children into protective care. At first, the case focused only on the abuse within the family. But as detectives dug deeper, they began hearing rumors that pointed to something even more sinister: missing girls linked to the West household. Detectives started to review old disappearance files, and suddenly the pieces began to align. Names of lodgers who had vanished, women who had once stayed at Cromwell Street but were never seen again. Runaways were last known to be in contact with Fred or Rose. What at first seemed like isolated cases began forming a disturbing pattern. And at the center of it was 25 Cromwell Street. By 1994, police had enough evidence to conduct a full search of the property. What began as a routine inquiry quickly escalated into one of the most notorious crime scene excavations in British history. Officers entered the garden with shovels and ground-penetrating equipment, not quite knowing what they would find. What they uncovered stunned even the most experienced detectives. In shallow pits beneath the patio and flower beds, they found bones, human remains, buried just feet from where the West children once played. The grim discoveries didn't stop in the garden. When investigators moved into the cellar, they unearthed more remains hidden beneath the floor. One by one, over the course of months, the secrets of Cromwell Street came to light. In total, police recovered the remains of at least 9 young women buried within the property. Many have been missing for years, their families living in agonizing uncertainty, never knowing what had happened. Among them were Lucy Partington, Shirley Hubbard, and other women whose cases had gone cold decades earlier. Each discovery was another confirmation of the nightmare rumors, and another devastating blow to the families who had spent years clinging to hope. News of the excavation exploded across Britain. Crowds gathered outside Cromwell Street, watching as officers carried evidence bags in and out of the house. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, dubbing the property the House of Horrors. Forensic tents covered the garden. Television broadcasts showed police digging through earth, pulling out fragments of clothing and bone. Each headline seemed worse than the last. For the West children, the revelations were almost too much to process. They had known their home was filled with fear and secrets, but even they hadn't realized the true scale of the horror buried beneath their feet. Fred West was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Rose, who at first denied any involvement, was also taken into custody as evidence of her complicity mounted. The couple who had once seemed inseparable now turned on each other, each shifting blame, each trying to save themselves. The investigation into Cromwell Street was one of the largest in modern British history. Teams of officers sifted through tons of soil, cataloging every fragment of evidence. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify remains that had been buried for decades. And as the case unfolded, the true scale of Fred and Rose West crimes became clearer. The number of victims was far greater than anyone had imagined. Fred West was finally arrested in 1994, and once he was in custody, the facade dropped. He began to talk. Not everything, not honestly, but enough to confirm the horror. He admitted to multiple murders. He even confessed to killing his own daughter, Heather, whose remains had been uncovered in the garden at Cromwell Street. For years, Heather's disappearance had been an open wound. Teachers, relatives, even neighbors had quietly asked questions. Fred had always brushed them off with a cold, rehearsed story. Heather had run away. She was off living her own life. But the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. Her body had been buried just feet from where the West children had played. Fred's confessions weren't full or straightforward. He minimized, he lied, he shifted blame. He tried to paint Rose as less involved. Even his evidence told another story. But before he could ever face a jury, Fred made a final, cowardly decision. On New Year's Day, 1995, he took his own life in prison. No trial, no full accounting, no chance for families to hear him answer for what he had done. That left Rose. Later that year, she went on trial at Winchester Crown Court. The case was massive, one of the biggest murder trials Britain had ever seen. Survivors took the stand, telling their stories. Forensic experts walked the jury through what had been found beneath Cromwell Street. Piece by piece, prosecutors laid out a picture of cruelty and control that spanned decades. Rose sat through it all, almost expressionless. Witness after witness, detail after detail, but she showed little reaction. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. She was convicted of 10 murders. The sentence, life in prison. And to this day, Rose West remains behind bars. As for the house, the infamous 25 Cromwell Street, it didn't survive long after the trial. In 1996, it was demolished. Authorities feared it would become a grim tourist attraction, a destination for people drawn to tragedy. So they tore it down, paved it over, and erased the building. But what happened there can never really be erased. The story of Fred and Rose West is not just about two killers. It's about how unimaginable evil can hide in plain sight. Behind the door of an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, in a quiet English city, there was a nightmare no one saw coming. Brick streets twisted between decaying buildings, and the air always carried the stench of coal smoke, refuse, and spilled alcohol. Crowds pressed together in the filthy alleyways. People slept in doorways to escape the cold, and arguments, robberies, and drunken fights were such a constant part of the background that most residents barely bothered to look up anymore. Life in this part of London was hard and unforgiving, and once the sun went down, nearly everyone hurried home with their heads down, hoping to avoid trouble and make it through the night. In the early hours of August 31st, 1888, just before 5 in the morning, a carman named Charles Cross was on his usual walk to work along a narrow road called Bucks Row. The sky was still black, the gas lamps barely cutting through the darkness, and the only sounds were the uneven echo of his footsteps and the distant rumble of wagon wheels. As he walked, he noticed something lying on the ground near a stable gate, a shape that at first glance looked like a discarded roll of fabric or maybe a bundle of rags left behind by workers. He slowed down, feeling a sudden unease he couldn't quite explain, and as he moved closer, he realized the shape was too rigid and too large to be what he first assumed. When he stepped near enough to see her clearly, he froze. It was a woman lying motionless on her back in the road. For a moment, he convinced himself she might simply be unconscious or drunk, which was a common sight in Whitechapel. But when another worker, Robert Paul, came walking up the street and joined him, the two men knelt beside her and immediately felt the sense of dread deepen. Her eyes were open and lifeless, staring upward with a blank expression that made both men recoil. When Paul touched her face, he realized her skin was cold. Her name was Marian Nichols, known to many locals as Polly. She was 43 years old, impoverished, and like countless women in Whitechapel, forced by circumstance to walk the streets at night in search of enough money to find a bed. As Cross and Paul looked closer, they saw the horrific wound across her throat, a cut so deep that it almost reached the spine, and the cobblestones beneath her head were slick with blood that was still fresh enough to shine in the weak glow of the street lamp. When police arrived, they initially suggested it might have been a violent robbery, a theory that would have fit the neighborhood perfectly. But that idea collapsed almost immediately when a doctor opened part of her clothing and discovered deep, deliberate slashes across her abdomen. Wounds so clean and controlled that medical examiners later said they appeared to have been made by someone with experience handling a knife. There was no sign that anything had been stolen, no evidence of panic or chaos, only precision and an almost chilling level of focus. Officers who examined the scene admitted quietly to one another that whoever had done this was neither impulsive nor clumsy. This was not the work of a thief or a drunken attacker. It was someone who wanted to inflict exactly this level of damage. Marion Nichols became the first officially recognized victim in a series of murders that would soon paralyze London with fear, although at the time, no one standing on Bucks Row that morning could have understood what was coming. Her body was carried away, the stones were washed, and residents passed by on their way to work with barely more than a glance, unaware that they were walking through the opening chapter of one of the darkest mysteries in criminal history. Because the man who killed Marion Nichols was not finished, and within days, Whitechapel would learn that they were not dealing with an ordinary murderer, but with someone who hunted with patience, precision, and purpose. In the days that followed the murder of Marion Nichols, the atmosphere in Whitechapel shifted from ordinary unease to something heavier and far more unsettling. People tried to carry on with their routines, but there was a noticeable tension in the air, as if everyone sensed something terrible lingering just beyond their line of sight. Women who normally walked unafraid at night now chose to stay indoors, and even hardened laborers and policemen began glancing nervously over their shoulders when they turned down dim passages or narrow streets. Rumors spread through pubs and lodging houses that a killer was out there, someone who moved silently and struck without warning. And by the end of the first week, every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. Would he do it again? On the morning of September 8th, 1888, barely a week after Marion's body was found, that question was answered in the most horrific way possible. At approximately 6 o'clock, a man named John Davis stepped into the small backyard behind the house where he rented a room at 29 Hanbury Street, a narrow building crowded with tenants. The moment he opened the door and stepped outside, he froze in shock at the sight in front of him. Lying on the ground near the steps was the body of Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman known around the neighborhood. Her throat had been cut in the same brutal and deliberate manner as Marion Nichols, but this time the scene was even more gruesome. Her abdomen had been opened and organs had been removed, taken with such precision that the police surgeon later insisted the killer must have possessed anatomical knowledge and steady skill with a blade. The brutality of the attack and the confidence with which it was carried out stunned investigators. It was clear this was not the violent chaos of a fight, but something almost methodical, something done by someone who was willing to take time, even while standing exposed in a backyard surrounded by houses, only feet from where people slept. The idea that the killer was willing to risk discovery so boldly terrified the public. It meant he felt untouchable and perhaps even enjoyed the danger. Word spread through Whitechapel in minutes, traveling from doorstep to doorstep until hundreds of people crowded Hanbury Street, whispering in fear and outrage, craning their necks hoping to catch sight of the police activity. Many residents could not stand to look directly at the horror that lay inside, and yet they remained there, refusing to leave, stunned into silence by the realization that the murder of Marion Nichols had not been a single tragic incident, but the beginning of something far darker. Within hours, newspapers across London printed headlines warning of a monster stalking the East End, a cold-blooded killer who struck without mercy and who, according to early rumors, might be a surgeon, a butcher, or someone with medical training. The idea that a man like that could slip unnoticed through crowded streets, select his victim, and vanish into the dark without a single witness terrified everyone. Overnight, the murders became the city's obsession, and the name Whitechapel transformed from a rough neighborhood into a place synonymous with fear. Police were overwhelmed by the pressure from the public and the press. Officers patrolled through the night, questioning anyone who seemed suspicious, but the truth was they had nothing. No weapon, no footprints, no reliable witness, and no motive beyond a level of violence that seemed designed to send message. People began sleeping in groups, businesses closed early, and women refused to walk alone even in daylight. Everyone wanted to believe the police would catch him before he could strike again, but deep down, most residents felt something colder and far more hopeless. This killer was not finished. Whoever he was, he had tasted control and chaos, and he would not stop until he wanted to. And they were right, because he was already planning his next night in the streets of Whitechapel. 3 weeks passed after the murder of Annie Chapman, and during that time, Whitechapel existed in a state of constant dread. Every sound in the alley behind a lodging house, every shadow that lingered too long at the corner of a dimly lit street, and every unfamiliar face passing through the market felt like a potential threat. The police presence nearly doubled. Patrolmen were stationed at nearly every major crossing, and detectives worked night and day. But despite the overwhelming pressure from newspapers and terrified residents, they were no closer to understanding who the killer was or when he might strike again. Each morning, people opened their doors cautiously, half expecting to find another body waiting in the street. Yet with each passing day, a strange and dangerous feeling began to grow. Some convinced themselves that maybe the killer had fled the city, or had been arrested on some unrelated charge, or perhaps even taken his own life. The hope was fragile, but it was still hope, and many clung to it. That illusion shattered in the early hours of September 30th, 1888, in a quiet yard off Burner Street. Shortly after 1 a.m., a man named Louis Deemschutz, returning home with his horse and cart, turned into the yard of the International Working Men's Educational Club. As the cart moved through the gate, the horse suddenly balked and refused to take another step forward. Deemschutz leaned down with a match to see what had startled the animal. In the weak flare of light, he saw a woman lying on the ground, her body collapsed just inside the yard entrance. She was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old woman known in the neighborhood. Her throat had been cut, though in contrast to the earlier victims, the rest of her body had not been mutilated. Her clothing was still intact, and nothing suggested the prolonged violence that had characterized the previous murders. Investigators quickly determined that the killer had been interrupted, likely fleeing the scene only moments before Deemschutz arrived. The realization that they had come within seconds of catching the murderer electrified everyone who heard the news and fueled the belief that he must still be only streets away. While police scrambled across Whitechapel searching for any trace of the fleeing figure, the killer himself continued his night in a way that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. Less than an hour after Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered, and only a short distance away in Mitre Square, a man named P.C. Watkins turned into the square during his routine patrol and stopped in horror at what he found lying near a building wall. The body was that of Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, and the scene around her was far worse than anything yet encountered. Her throat had been slashed like the others, but the mutilations to her face and abdomen were so severe and so precise that the doctor who examined her later said the killer must have worked with unwavering speed and confidence to accomplish it in such a narrow window of time. Organs were removed and taken from the scene, proving that the killer had a deep knowledge of anatomy and complete control over himself even while standing exposed in a public square. The terrifying nature of the double event, as newspapers soon named it, sent a shockwave through London. In a single night, the killer had struck twice, first interrupted and then finishing what he likely considered unfinished work only a short walk away. For investigators, the implications were devastating. Not only was the murderer fearless enough to kill twice within the span of an hour, but he also moved with such ease and confidence that he was able to vanish before police arriving only minutes behind him. Many officers were forced to confront the possibility that the killer might have walked right past them as they searched the streets. Within hours, newspapers printed emergency editions, crowds gathered in the streets demanding protection, and arguments raged about whether the killer was a doctor, a foreigner, a butcher, a madman, or something worse. Panic turned to anger. Anger turned to chaos, and Whitechapel descended into unrest. More disturbing still was the undeniable message the killer had delivered. Not only was he still here, but he could outmaneuver the police and kill whenever he chose. And in the days ahead, he would make it unmistakably clear that he was watching everything, listening to every rumor, and enjoying every second of the terror he had created. Because soon, a letter would arrive that would give him a name the world would never forget. In the chaotic days following the double murders, London felt like a city holding its breath. Crowds gathered outside police stations demanding answers. Newspapers released wild theories about surgeons, butchers, occultists, and secret societies, and a fear that had gripped Whitechapel spread across the entire city. Detectives were overwhelmed with tips, sightings, and accusations, most of them useless. And in the middle of this rising hysteria, something unexpected arrived that turned the case from a terrifying investigation into a worldwide legend. A letter was delivered to the Central News Agency, written in red ink on rough paper and addressed not to the police, but to the press. The handwriting appeared rushed but deliberate, the tone disturbingly casual, and from the first line it became obvious that the writer was either the killer himself or someone who wanted to speak in his voice. He mocked investigators for their failures, ridiculed the panic spreading through the streets, and described details of the murders with a confidence that made the letter almost unbearable to read. He promised he would kill again soon, and he ended the message with a signature that would burn itself into history. Jack the Ripper. When the newspapers printed the name, it spread through London like a firestorm. The public seized it immediately, repeating it in taverns, shouting it in the streets, and whispering it as if speaking it quietly might somehow keep the man himself from hearing. For the first time, the killer had an identity, even if it was only a name he had chosen for himself, and that identity gave him power. Instead of an unknown murderer hiding in the shadows, he became a figure of myth, a phantom capable of striking anywhere, at any moment, without warning. The police insisted the letter might be a hoax, but privately many detectives feared that the handwriting and the tone felt too authentic and too confident, and they could not dismiss the possibility that the killer had not only been watching their investigation closely, but had decided to join the conversation to control the story and manipulate the fear he was creating. People began to believe that this man was not only murdering, but enjoying the panic and attention his crimes generated, and the idea that he might be studying their reactions only deepened the terror. By the time the full text of the letter appeared in print, London was no longer simply frightened. It was obsessed. Every man became a suspect. Every alley became a threat. And every night, the quiet streets of Whitechapel seemed to echo with the same question. Where would Jack the Ripper strike next? And they would not have to wait long to find out, because his next victim would push the limits of horror beyond anything the city had seen before. Newspapers turned every scrap of information into sensational front-page headlines. Yet despite the overwhelming attention, investigators were no closer to catching Jack the Ripper than they had been after the first killing. He seemed to move like smoke through the narrow streets, always one step ahead, always waiting for the perfect moment while the city trembled and waited helplessly for the next body. That moment came on the morning of November 9th, 1888. At a little after 10:45 a.m., Thomas Bowyer, an assistant to a local lodging house owner, walked to collect overdue rent from a small room in Miller's Court, a cramped courtyard off Dorset Street. He knocked on the door of Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman who had been living alone in a tiny single-room flat. When she didn't answer, he pushed aside the curtain covering the small broken window and looked inside to see if she was there. What he saw through the glass was so horrific that he staggered backward and ran for help, shouting for the police. Inside that small room, lying on the bed, was the body of Mary Jane Kelly, and the crime scene was unlike anything any investigator in London had ever encountered. Her throat had been cut, but beyond that, the mutilation was so extensive and so methodical that even hardened detectives struggled to speak after entering the room. The scene was so brutal that many details were withheld from the public for decades. and even modern forensic experts describe it as one of the most extreme examples of mutilation in criminal history. It was clear the killer had taken his time, protected by the privacy of four walls rather than the open streets where he had previously carried out his attacks. For the first time, he had controlled the environment completely, and the level of violence reflected that freedom. The investigators who gathered inside Miller's court knew instantly that they were standing at the peak of the nightmare that had consumed the city. This was the signature of a man who had grown more confident, more deliberate, and more deeply committed to the horror he created. But even more terrifying was the possibility that he might now feel satisfied enough to disappear. Because if he simply stopped, without witnesses or evidence, how could they ever prove who he was? The murder of Mary Jane Kelly is widely considered the final canonical killing of Jack the Ripper. After her death, the brutal streak simply ended. There were suspects, accusations, arrests, and endless theories, but no confessions, no trials, and no definitive answers. The letters stopped. The sightings faded. The killer seemed to dissolve into history without leaving a trace behind. In the years that followed, thousands of investigators, police, journalists, and researchers would attempt to solve the identity of Jack the Ripper. More than 100 suspects have been named, ranging from doctors and butchers to royalty and mentally ill vagrants, but every theory collapses under scrutiny. More than a century later, despite modern forensics, psychological profiling, and endless analysis, his name remains unknown. What began with a single body on a dark street in Whitechapel became a mystery that refuses to die. A story that still chills anyone who walks through those narrow London alleys today. Because Jack the Ripper was not just a murderer. He became something else entirely. A ghost that changed the way the world thinks about fear, crime, and the darkness that can hide inside an ordinary man. And the most unsettling part of the entire story is not what he did. It is the fact that he got away. Fear and murder don't always take the same shape. If Jack the Ripper struck with knives in the shadows, another killer would strike decades later with something far more invisible, far more insidious: radiation. In November 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian spy turned whistleblower, sat down for tea in a London hotel and was dead within weeks. No stabbing, no bonfire, no immediate violence. The weapon was nearly undetectable, deadly in the tiniest particles. This is the story of the polonium ghost. In the months before his death, Alexander Litvinenko was a man who had already survived more threats than most people could imagine. Once a colonel in Russia's secret services, he had turned against the agency he had served, speaking out about corruption, abuse, and alleged plots that reached the highest levels of power. After fleeing Russia, he settled in London, convinced that Britain would be a safe haven, a place far from the dangers of Moscow's shadowy world. But safety, as it turned out, is an illusion. On a cold November evening in 2006, Litvinenko met two men at the Millennium Hotel in London, men he had reason to distrust but agreed to see. They were polite, professional, and seemingly harmless, men who smiled, drank tea, and discussed matters of mutual concern. No one in the bustling hotel could have suspected that within moments, something deadly was being passed from hand to hand, something that would silently infiltrate his body and destroy it from the inside. Litvinenko had no idea that he was about to meet a killer so invisible that even the most experienced doctors would struggle to identify it. And by the time the first symptoms appeared, the trail had already begun to spread, leaving a ghostly signature that would haunt London and the world. A few days after meeting the two men at the Millennium Hotel, Litvinenko's health began deteriorating in ways that no one around him could have predicted. What began as mild fatigue and nausea quickly escalated into relentless fever, uncontrollable vomiting, and excruciating pain that left him unable to stand or speak without assistance. Doctors were baffled. Standard tests revealed nothing conclusive, and every explanation seemed inadequate to account for the rapid decline of a man who had, until recently, been healthy and strong. Friends and colleagues watched helplessly as his condition worsened, and a creeping sense of dread settled over those closest to him. Because even in the 21st century, something was at work here that no one had encountered before. As the hours passed, Litvinenko himself began to suspect the unthinkable, that he had been poisoned. But this was no ordinary toxin. It was invisible, undetectable to conventional medical tests, and extraordinarily rare, polonium-210, a substance so deadly that a single gram could theoretically kill millions. It could be handled carefully by the person administering it without immediate risk to them. He had ingested it, likely in his tea, and it was already coursing through his body, destroying cells, attacking organs, and leaving a trail of radioactivity in its wake. Every step he took, every item he touched, became a potential hazard, and the very streets of London were unknowingly contaminated by the movement of his poisoned body. Doctors and investigators were suddenly thrust into a race against time unlike any they had faced before. Specialists from multiple agencies were called in to measure radiation, trace contamination, and attempt to identify the source of this seemingly supernatural attack. Litvinenko's hotel room became a sealed crime scene. The taxi he had ridden in, the restaurants he had eaten at, and even the documents he had handled were tested for traces of polonium. Each surface he touched became a silent witness to the murder. Each location a deadly clue that investigators had to follow before more people were harmed. Meanwhile, Litvinenko himself continued to deteriorate, enduring pain so severe that he later described it as burning from the inside out. He recorded videos explaining who he believed had poisoned him, naming names and detailing the circumstances, leaving a chilling record for investigators to follow. In those final days, his home became a hospital, an office, and a war room all at once. Doctors tried to stabilize him, detectives traced the trail, and forensic scientists began to map the invisible path of death he had unknowingly carried across London. By the time authorities began connecting the dots, it was clear that this was not just a personal attack, but a meticulously planned assassination. The killer had calculated exposure, dosage, timing, and even the public setting, ensuring that Litvinenko would suffer visibly, instilling fear, and leaving investigators scrambling for answers while the man himself was dying quietly in a London hospital, aware that his death was imminent, yet determined to leave a record of the truth behind. London had become the scene of a crime unlike any before, a murder that was invisible to the naked eye, silent in its execution, and yet terrifying in its scope. By the time Litvinenko took his last breath, the city and the world would understand that modern assassins no longer needed to confront their victims face to face, because some killers could move invisibly, leaving nothing but traces of radiation and the cold, lingering question of who could be next. As Alexander Litvinenko lay in a London hospital, fading with every passing hour, a citywide investigation was already underway, one that would challenge the expertise of intelligence agencies, medical examiners, and forensic scientists alike. Detectives and specialists faced a situation unlike anything they had ever encountered. A man poisoned with polonium-210, a radioactive isotope so rare that it is strictly controlled, almost impossible to obtain, and deadly even in microscopic amounts. From the very first test, it became clear that this was not an accident, nor a random act of violence, but a carefully calculated assassination. Investigators retraced every step Litvinenko had taken in the days following his fateful meeting at the Millennium Hotel. His movements, walking through crowded streets, riding taxis, dining at restaurants, even handling documents and personal effects, were mapped with painstaking detail. Each location was measured for radiation. Floors, tables, door handles, and upholstery became crime scenes. The invisible killer had left a trail that no ordinary detective could have imagined, contaminating London itself with a silent, deadly signature. Every person who had come into contact with him, knowingly or unknowingly, had been exposed to a substance that could cause severe illness or death, transforming the investigation from a single murder into a public health emergency. Surveillance footage, Hotel logs and witness statements quickly focused attention on two Russian men who had met Litvinenko at the Millennium Hotel in the hours before his illness began. They were described as polite, professional, and unassuming. Men who blended perfectly into public spaces, yet they carried a weapon invisible to the naked eye, capable of killing without leaving a trace. British authorities began to suspect that these men were not acting independently, but had been sent with precise instructions and the resources of a powerful state behind them. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify the source of the polonium-210, tracing it through laboratories, shipping records, and intelligence networks. The isotope's rarity meant it could not have been obtained casually, and investigators concluded that the poison had almost certainly been prepared by individuals with both expertise and official backing. Every discovery pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. This was a murder orchestrated at the highest levels, an assassination designed not just to kill, but to send a message. Meanwhile, Litvinenko himself remained conscious enough to speak to the press and authorities, leaving a chilling record of his suspicions. He named the people he believed responsible, described the circumstances of the poisoning, and in doing so, ensured that even in death, he would expose the lengths to which his enemies were willing to go. His testimony, combined with the painstaking forensic work, gradually built a picture of an audacious plot, one that crossed national borders, involved high-level operatives, and utilized a method of killing so silent, so unusual, that it would remain unprecedented in modern criminal history. By the time Litvinenko's condition worsened, London had become a city transformed. Police, scientists, and medical staff were not just investigating a murder. They were chasing an invisible killer, attempting to understand a weapon that could not be seen, touched, or smelled. Every day was a race to trace the trail before more lives were endangered, and every clue revealed the extraordinary sophistication of those responsible. In the end, the investigation would confirm what everyone feared. This was not random. It was deliberate, calculated, and chillingly efficient. A modern assassination carried out in broad daylight, in one of the world's busiest cities, using a weapon that left almost no immediate evidence, and only one tragic, inevitable outcome: death. On November 23, 2006, after weeks of agonizing illness, Alexander Litvinenko died in a London hospital, his body ravaged from the inside by polonium-210, a poison so rare and deadly that the very air he breathed, the tea he drank, and the surfaces he touched became part of a trail for investigators to follow. His death marked the climax of a crime that was unlike any other, a murder that did not rely on knives, bullets, or physical confrontation, but on meticulous planning, scientific knowledge, and cold-blooded patience. The world was suddenly forced to confront a terrifying reality. In the modern era, assassins could strike silently, invisibly, and with a reach that crossed borders effortlessly. The aftermath of Litvinenko's death was chaotic, terrifying, and unprecedented. The Millennium Hotel, taxis, restaurants, and even office buildings he had entered became contamination zones, as investigators and scientists raced against time to map the spread of radioactive particles. Dozens of people have been exposed to dangerous radiation, some unaware for days, turning London itself into a crime scene. The investigation became a global spectacle, with journalists, intelligence agencies, and forensic experts trying to piece together a puzzle that was invisible to the naked eye. As authorities delved deeper, evidence began to point toward two Russian nationals who had met with Litvinenko shortly before he fell ill. Surveillance footage, hotel records, and witness accounts tracked their movements with unnerving precision. Experts concluded that the men had likely been acting on behalf of a state organization, equipped with access to one of the rarest and deadliest substances on Earth, and with instructions to strike in a way that would leave almost no trace. Every piece of the investigation reinforced a chilling conclusion. This was not a personal vendetta, nor a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated, professional, and politically motivated assassination. Public reaction was a mixture of horror and disbelief. Here was a man, living in one of the safest cities in the world, killed by a substance so deadly it could cross rooms, touch surfaces, and silently threaten anyone nearby. Experts struggled to convey the danger. Governments debated how to respond. The media described the murder as both science fiction and state terror. Meanwhile, Litvinenko had already left his mark. Through videos, testimony, and records he maintained in his final days, he ensured that the world would know the names of those he believed responsible, that his death would not go unnoticed, and that the audacity of such an assassination would be remembered forever. Ultimately, Litvinenko's murder exposed vulnerabilities few had imagined, and it became a chilling reminder that power, science, and fear could combine in ways that bypass conventional security entirely. A city that had once felt safe now realized that killers could be invisible, poison could be lethal without warning, and that modern assassins do not need to confront their victims face to face. The polonium ghost, as it came to be called, left a trail of terror, a story of science turned into murder, and a lesson about how, in the wrong hands, the deadliest weapons can be the ones we cannot see. Alexander Litvinenko's death did more than shock the world. It exposed a chilling reality about the modern age. Killers no longer needed to wield knives or guns, and murder could be executed with invisible, silent weapons that traveled across cities, countries, and even continents, leaving no immediate evidence but unimaginable consequences. The polonium-210 that destroyed Litvinenko also left behind a trail of questions, fear, and suspicion, showing the world how vulnerable anyone could be, even in the most secure, civilized environments. The investigation confirmed what many had feared. The attack had been orchestrated with the knowledge, resources, and reach of a state, carried out with precision that was both scientific and terrifying. Every person, every object, every building Litvinenko touched became a potential danger, forcing authorities to trace a deadly invisible map across London. Taxi drivers, restaurant staff, and hotel employees unknowingly carried fragments of poison. And for weeks, the city was quietly in crisis, proving that the weapon itself was only part of the horror. The true terror was the complete unpredictability of where it might strike next. Litvinenko's final days were also a testament to courage and foresight. Even as his body deteriorated under the invisible assault, he documented his suspicions, identified his attackers, and ensured that his story could not be erased. He transformed from victim to messenger, leaving a warning that the modern world was now a battlefield where science and politics could merge in a silent, deadly power. The polonium ghost became a symbol of what happens when political motives, scientific knowledge, and ruthless intent converge. It reminded governments, intelligence agencies, and ordinary people that security is never absolute, that modern killers can strike without leaving a single visible clue, and that even cities thought safe can become the hunting grounds of an assassin operating in the shadows. Today, more than a decade later, Litvinenko's story continues to fascinate, terrify, and educate. It serves as a cautionary tale about how fear has evolved. It can now be microscopic, invisible, and almost impossible to detect, yet as lethal as any blade. And just like Jack the Ripper in the streets of Whitechapel over a century earlier, the polonium ghost reminds us that the deadliest killers are often the ones we never see coming, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered and a shadow that lingers long after the body is gone.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share if you want more.
In March of 2009, Claudia Elizabeth Lawrence was 35 years old and, to most people, looked like she was living a perfectly ordinary life. Born in Malton, North Yorkshire, in 1974, Claudia grew up in a loving family. Her father, Peter, was a well-known solicitor in the area, and her mother, Joan, later served as mayor of their hometown. Claudia had one older sister, Ali, and by all accounts her childhood had been happy, comfortable, and secure. As she grew older, Claudia followed her passion for food. She trained at catering college and, after working at local pubs and restaurants, eventually found steady employment as a chef at the University of York. By 2006, she was working at Goodrich College on campus, serving hundreds of students every day. She liked the early morning shifts. It meant she had her afternoons free, and she had a reputation for being cheerful, reliable, and dependable. If Claudia said she'd be somewhere, she was there. No excuses, no delays. In 2007, Claudia bought her own home, a modest two-bedroom terraced cottage on Hughes Road, just outside York's historic city centre. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was hers, and it gave her a sense of independence. She decorated it simply, kept it tidy, and lived alone. Her neighbors remembered her as friendly but private, someone who smiled and said hello, but mostly kept to herself. Claudia's daily life followed a comforting rhythm. She walked to work along the same quiet routes each morning, a 3-mile journey that took her past local shops and houses. At the end of her shift, usually around 2:30 in the afternoon, she'd head home, often stopping to chat with a friend on her mobile phone. She didn't own a smartphone or use social media. Instead, she relied on an old Nokia-style handset. For Claudia, technology didn't matter much. What mattered were the people around her. Her parents were central to her life, especially her dad. Claudia spoke to Peter almost every day, whether in person or on the phone. The two were close, and Peter adored his daughter. To him, Claudia seemed grounded, content, and happy. She had a steady job, a home of her own, and a solid circle of friends. Everything about her life appeared stable and safe. But away from her family's eyes, Claudia's personal world was a little more complicated. She had a wide social circle and was often seen at the Nag's Head, a pub just across the street from her house. She liked to unwind there after work, chatting with locals over a drink, catching up on gossip, and watching soap operas like Hollyoaks. Friends described her as sociable, warm, and sometimes flirtatious, enjoying male attention but not necessarily looking for anything long-term. As police would later uncover, Claudia had also been involved in several romantic relationships, some of them secret. Some of the men she spent time with were married, and at least one was believed to have links abroad. These relationships were not something she discussed with her parents, and they painted a different picture of her private life than the one most people saw. Still, nothing about her routine suggested danger. Claudia was not reckless. She wasn't known for wild behavior. She enjoyed nights out, but she wasn't the type to vanish into strangers' cars or disappear for days without telling someone. For those who knew her best, Claudia's life looked comfortable, even ordinary. On the evening of March 18, 2009, everything about Claudia seemed normal. She worked her morning shift, finished early, and returned home. Later, she called her parents, chatting with her mother about plans for Mother's Day and telling her dad she'd see him soon. The conversations were easy and light, nothing to suggest she was worried or upset. Around 8:30 p.m., she exchanged text messages with a friend. At 9:12 p.m., she received another text from a friend living in Cyprus, though no one knows if she ever read it. That night, Claudia went to bed in her little terraced house like she always did, planning to get up early for her shift the next morning. To anyone watching, her life looked peaceful, normal, safe. But investigators would later learn that, beneath the surface, Claudia's world was not as simple as it appeared. Hidden in the quiet routines were secrets, relationships, and complications that would take on a chilling significance after she vanished without a trace. At 5:57 a.m. on March 18, 2009, CCTV cameras at the University of York captured Claudia arriving at work, just as she always did. She clocked in at Goodrich College, tied on her chef's apron, and spent the morning preparing breakfasts and lunches for staff and students. Her shift ended around 2:30 p.m., and she left the campus, walking the familiar route back to her cottage in Hugh. A neighbor later recalled seeing her along Hughes Road that afternoon, looking completely ordinary, carrying herself the way she always did. Back at home, she settled into her evening routine. She phoned her parents, first her father, Peter, then her mother, Joan. With her dad, she made plans to meet the following day. With her mum, she chatted about Mother's Day, which was coming up that weekend. The calls were light, relaxed, the kind of normal check-ins she made all the time. Later, Claudia rang a friend and spoke casually about her evening. Around 8:30 p.m., she sent a text message, and at 9:12 p.m., she received another from a friend living in Cyprus. No one knows for sure if she ever opened it. Nothing in those conversations raised any alarm. Claudia's voice was upbeat. She sounded content. Everything about her life, in that moment, appeared completely normal. But the next morning, March 19th, Claudia didn't show up for her 6 a.m. shift at the university kitchens. And for Claudia, someone known for her reliability and punctuality, that was unthinkable. It was the first tiny crack in the ordinary rhythm of her life. And soon, that crack would widen into one of Britain's most baffling mysteries. When Claudia didn't show up for her 6 a.m. shift on March 19th, her co-workers were immediately uneasy. This was not the kind of person who overslept, skipped work, or forgot to call in. In fact, colleagues described her as reliable to a fault. You could set your watch by her, one said later. When repeated calls to her mobile went unanswered, alarm bells started ringing. Her father, Peter Lawrence, quickly became worried. By evening, he drove to her small terraced home in Hugh to check on her. The scene inside was unsettling in its ordinariness. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in or struggle. The house appeared as if Claudia had gone through a typical night at home. Her bed looked slept in. On a chair in her bedroom, her neatly folded chef's whites were laid out for the next day's shift. In the kitchen, plates and cutlery were still in place from a meal she'd made the night before. Nothing screamed chaos or panic. But the small details told a different story. Her toothbrush was missing from the bathroom, suggesting she had woken up and started her morning routine. Yet her handbag, her Nokia mobile phone, and her house keys were nowhere to be found. These were items she always took with her when she left the house. The fact that none of them were ever recovered would haunt the investigation for years. Detectives quickly established Claudia's last confirmed movements. On the afternoon of March 18th, she was captured on CCTV at 3:05 p.m., walking home along Hugh Road. Later that evening, she phoned both of her parents, chatting with her dad, making plans for the following day, and discussing Mother's Day plans with her mum. At 8:23 p.m., she sent a text to a friend. At 9:12 p.m., she received another text from a friend who was living in Cyprus. After that, nothing. From 9:12 p.m. onward, her phone went dark. No calls, no texts, no sign she ever picked up that last message. Sometime overnight, the device either ran out of battery or was deliberately switched off. For someone like Claudia, who normally kept in regular contact with friends and family, that silence was chilling. The next morning, when she should have been walking her familiar 3-mile route to campus, Claudia was gone. Police searched her home, the garden, and the surrounding streets. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no trace of a struggle, no signs that she had been forced out of the house. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no shouts, no strange noises, no suspicious activity. It was as though Claudia had simply walked out of her front door and vanished into the early morning air. Investigators checked CCTV around York, hoping to track her movements after 9 p.m. on March 18. But beyond the 3:05 p.m. footage of her walking home, there were no confirmed images. They searched for sightings on her walk-to-work route, the path she always used between Hugh and the university, but there was nothing. Forensic teams combed her house for evidence, but found no fingerprints, no DNA from strangers, no signs of forced entry. It was a mystery without a single solid clue. Equally baffling was the absence of financial activity. Claudia's bank accounts remained untouched. Her wages, which had just been deposited, sat unused. She didn't withdraw money. She didn't use her cards. For someone who lived independently and relied on her job, this financial silence was alarming. And as the days passed, no credible sightings came in. Not a single confirmed witness saw her after that last CCTV clip. No one remembered seeing her leave for work. No one recalled seeing her meet anyone. It was as if Claudia had been swallowed whole by the darkness on Hugh Road. Her disappearance shook York to its core. Here was a young woman with a steady job, a close family, and a regular routine, gone without explanation, without a trace. Police initially treated it as a missing persons case, hoping she might have chosen to go away for a few days, maybe to visit friends. But those hopes faded quickly. Claudia hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't taken extra clothes. Her passport was still in the house, and her close friends all said the same thing: Claudia would never just vanish. As the investigation deepened, detectives began asking new questions. If Claudia hadn't disappeared on her walk to work, did something happen the night before? Did someone visit her house? Or had she left willingly to meet someone she trusted, only for things to go terribly wrong? The answers to those questions would remain elusive. But from that day forward, the case of Claudia Lawrence would shift from a missing persons inquiry into something far darker. At first, Claudia's disappearance looked like any other missing person case. Police checked her home. They retraced her route to work. They knocked on doors, canvassed neighbors, and put up posters all across York. But as the days ticked by, the picture started to change. There were no sightings, no phone calls, no activity on her bank accounts. Nothing. And that was strange, because Claudia wasn't the type to just vanish. She spoke to her parents almost every single day. She was reliable at work, the kind of person you could set your watch by. If she didn't show up, something was wrong. Detectives started to ask themselves a chilling question: had something, or someone, deliberately silenced her? When investigators dug into Claudia's private life, they began to uncover details that her family admitted they didn't fully know. Claudia had been romantically linked to several men. Some were colleagues, some were married, others lived abroad. Friends even said she kept in touch with people in Cyprus, a place she had visited before. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the question wasn't just, was she attacked on her way to work? It was, did someone she already knew, a lover, a friend, maybe even a neighbor, have reason to harm her? One senior officer would later describe Claudia's case as a very complex puzzle. The investigation deepens. Detectives began methodically working through Claudia's world. They interviewed her co-workers at the University of York kitchens. They went door to door on Hewth Road. They reviewed hours of CCTV footage, but the trail was thin. The only confirmed image of Claudia was from March 18, her walking home after work. No footage of her leaving for work the next morning. No footage of her with anyone else. No cars pulling up. It was as if she had simply vanished. Over the next decade, Claudia's disappearance became one of the largest investigations in North Yorkshire police history. Thousands of interviews, hundreds of statements, land and property searched across York. And then, in 2013, after 4 years of getting nowhere, detectives made a grim announcement. They no longer believed Claudia was missing. They believed she had been murdered. That same year, they arrested a 59-year-old man on suspicion of her murder. He was questioned, but released. No charges. By 2014, the case needed new eyes. A fresh team of detectives went back through everything. They checked old statements. They re-interviewed witnesses. They looked at suspects again. And once more, Claudia's complicated private life became the focus. Investigators were blunt. They believed she may have been harmed by someone she knew intimately. That year, the case was reclassified. No longer a missing person search. This was now a murder inquiry. Forensic teams carried out new searches. Fields and drains were dug up. Garages and outbuildings scoured. Even areas near Claudia's home excavated. Specialist dogs were brought in, trained to detect human remains. Each search made headlines, but none revealed the breakthrough police were desperate for. The arrests then came a string of arrests. In 2014, the men in their 50s, all believed to be known to Claudia, were taken into custody. Their homes were searched. They were questioned for days. But again, nothing stuck. All four were released. In 2015, another man was arrested. The media swarmed. Speculation exploded. And then, just like before, he too was released. Between 2013 and 2015, 6 men were arrested on suspicion of murder. Not one was charged. As the years dragged on, police began facing criticism. Some said detectives had leaned too heavily into Claudia's private life, unfairly focusing on her relationships and painting her in a negative light. Others believed key forensic opportunities were missed in those early, critical days. Through it all, Claudia's father, Peter Lawrence, never stopped fighting. He pushed the case into the headlines. He spoke to the press. He met with police. And he made one thing clear. Yes, Claudia had relationships. But that didn't mean she deserved what happened to her. And it didn't excuse the fact that, after years of searching, there were still no answers. More than a decade later, Claudia Lawrence is still missing. In 2021, North Yorkshire Police made it official. They classified her case as a suspected murder. But even now, her body has never been found. For her father, Peter Lawrence, the uncertainty was unbearable. He became the face of the fight for answers. He pushed for better support for families of the missing. He gave interviews. He campaigned. He refused to let Claudia's name fade from the headlines. But that same year, 2021, Peter passed away. And he died without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. Today, if you walk through York, you can still find her face. On posters, on appeals, on reminders that she is gone, but not forgotten. And her story stands as something darker. A reminder that even in the safest, quietest English town, someone can walk out their front door, step into the night, and vanish without a trace. In May of 1957, in a rough suburb of Newcastle called Scotswood, Mary Flora Bell came into the world. From the very start, her life was chaos. Her mother, Betty, was just 17 when she gave birth and wanted little to do with her baby. Betty worked as a sex worker and often disappeared for long stretches of time, leaving Mary neglected. Relatives would later say that Betty not only failed to care for Mary, but actively tried to get rid of her. They claimed she once pushed her infant daughter out of a window, another time slipped sleeping pills into her food. There were even whispers that Betty had on multiple occasions attempted to give Mary away to strangers. Her father, Billy Bell, was absent most of the time. He was a criminal with a record of armed robbery, and he too had no stable role in her upbringing. That left Mary in a house where chaos was constant, arguments were routine, and affection was non-existent. The message Mary absorbed early on was chillingly simple: she wasn't wanted. By the time she started school, Mary's behavior was already alarming. Teachers described her as withdrawn one moment, explosively angry the next. Other children said she would switch suddenly, laughing one second, violent the next. Once, on the playground, she tried to choke another girl, wrapping her small hands around the child's throat. Another time, she pinned down a boy and squeezed until he gasped for breath. What struck people later wasn't just the violence itself, it was the look in Mary's eyes. Witnesses said it wasn't rage, it was curiosity, and yet, nothing was done. Scotswood was a hard, neglected place. Rows of crumbling terraced houses lined the streets, many of them half abandoned. Kids ran wild in bomb sites left over from the war, playing in rubble and derelict buildings. Adults worked long hours or drank in pubs, while children were left to their own devices. In a community like that, kids fighting or lashing out wasn't unusual. Mary's cruelty blended into the background. People whispered that she was the strange one, but no one stepped in. As Mary grew older, her manipulative streak became more obvious. She could be charming, even sweet, when it suited her. She'd smile at teachers, speak politely to adults, and then, the moment no one was looking, she would torment younger children. Friends recalled how she liked to play dangerous games, dangling toddlers over ledges, squeezing their necks, laughing when they cried. Once, she was seen holding a pillow over a baby's face, only stopping when caught. These weren't accidents. They were tests. Mary wanted to see how far she could go. At home, things weren't any better. Betty's neglect was constant, and Mary was often exposed to things no child should see. Visitors claimed she was forced to witness her mother's work, overhearing conversations and encounters far beyond her years. Some researchers later suggested this desensitized her, stripping away any chance she had to develop empathy. Psychologists would one day argue that Mary's childhood left her wired differently. She didn't feel guilt the way most kids did. She didn't form attachments the way most kids did. What she did learn, though, was how to control people. By the age of 10, she had a reputation in Scotswood. Parents warned their children to be careful around her, but Mary still found plenty of playmates among the younger kids who were too naive to understand the danger. To them, she was just another girl in pigtails, wandering the streets, inviting them to play. What they didn't realize was that Mary's idea of play was far darker. In May of 1968, only days before her 11th birthday, something happened that showed just how far Mary was willing to go. A 3-year-old boy was discovered wandering the streets, dazed and crying. When asked what happened, he said Mary had pushed him and another child off the top of an air raid shelter. Both boys had fallen, one badly injured, but they survived. When confronted, Mary brushed it off, smiling innocently. Adults called it an accident. But for those who knew her, it was another warning sign. And then came the incident that sealed everything. In May of that same year, just 2 weeks later, 4-year-old Martin Brown was found dead in an abandoned house in Scotswood. There were no obvious injuries, and police initially assumed he'd swallowed pills left lying around. But when his body was examined, bruises were found on his neck. He hadn't been poisoned. He had been strangled. What no one knew at that point was that Mary Bell had been there, the 10-year-old girl who teachers called strange, the child who had already tried to choke her classmates, had now killed. And chillingly, this was just the beginning. On May 25, 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, Mary Bell acted on her darkest impulses. That afternoon, she crossed paths with a little boy named Martin Brown. He was only 4 years old, full of energy, and playing around Scotswood, as children often did in that neighborhood. Mary coaxed him toward an abandoned house on St. Margaret's Road, a derelict property where local kids sometimes played. Inside that empty house, with its peeling paint and broken windows, Mary lured Martin into an upstairs room. No one knows exactly what she said, or how she convinced him to stay close. But what is known is that moments later, she placed her small hands around his throat and squeezed. The force wasn't strong by adult standards, but Martin was just a child. He struggled, but Mary didn't stop. When it was over, Martin lay still on the dusty floorboards. He had been strangled to death by an 11-year-old girl. Later that day, his body was discovered. To the adults who rushed in, the scene was confusing. Martin showed no obvious signs of trauma. There were no stab wounds, no blood, nothing that screamed violence. The only marks were faint bruises on his neck, so subtle they were initially overlooked. Police at first believed he may have swallowed tablets left behind in the abandoned house. The death was treated as a tragic accident. In their minds, there was no way a child could have killed another child. But Mary knew exactly what she had done, and for her, the death wasn't enough. In the days that followed, she seemed almost exhilarated. While most killers her age, if such a thing even existed, might have hidden in shame or fear, Mary did the opposite. She flaunted her secret, testing how much she could get away with. Just a few days after Martin's death, she and her friend, Norma Joyce Bell, no relation, just a girl from the same neighborhood, broke into a nursery. Inside, they scrawled messages on scraps of paper in crude handwriting. The notes were shocking. "We did murder Martin Brown. I kill so I may come back. They think it's normal." To the police, when these notes surfaced, it looked like some sick prank. Investigators dismissed them as children's mischief, not serious confessions. But in reality, the messages were exactly what they appeared to be. Mary was bragging about what she had done. And she didn't stop there. Mary went to see Martin's grieving family. Just days after the funeral had been arranged, she knocked on the door of the Brown household. Martin's mother answered. Standing there was a small girl with neat hair, blue eyes, and an expression that seemed strangely calm for the circumstances. Mary asked if she could come inside and see Martin in his coffin. Shocked, his mother told her no. But then Mary said something that froze the woman in place. She told her she already knew he was dead. There was no sadness in her voice, no hesitation, just a flat, cold statement, delivered like a fact. To Martin's mother, it felt deeply unsettling, though at the time she could never have guessed the truth, that this 11-year-old was the one who had taken her child's life. For Mary, the thrill wasn't just in the act of killing, it was in the aftermath. She seemed to enjoy inserting herself into the tragedy, circling around the grief she had caused, and quietly reminding herself of the power she held. Meanwhile, police continued treating Martin's death as an accident. They had no idea that, walking freely around Scotswood, playing in the streets and attending school like any other child, was a girl who had just committed murder. And chillingly, she wasn't finished. Just 10 weeks after Martin Brown's death, on July 31, 1968, Mary Bell struck again. This time, her victim was even younger. 3-year-old Brian Howe lived just a few streets away from Mary, in the same cramped Scotswood neighborhood. That afternoon, Brian was playing near his home, as kids often did. It was summer, the kind of day where children roamed freely from yard to yard, popping in and out of sight. But when Brian didn't return home for tea, his family grew worried. Neighbors began searching. Within hours, a local boy made a horrific discovery on a patch of wasteland near St. Margaret's Road. There, lying in the dirt among broken bottles and scattered rubbish, was Brian Howe's small body. Unlike Martin, whose death had initially been ruled an accident, Brian's injuries left no doubt. He had been strangled. His lips and fingernails bore the telltale signs of suffocation. Clumps of his blonde hair had been hacked away with scissors in jagged, uneven patches. His legs had been scratched and punctured with a pair of broken scissors, and his genitals mutilated. Most shocking of all, carved into the soft flesh of his stomach, were the faint outlines of the letter M. It was a level of cruelty far beyond childhood mischief. This was sadism, and it sent shockwaves through Newcastle. The community that had tried to dismiss Martin Brown's death as an accident could no longer look away. Something was terribly wrong in Scotswood. Northumbria police launched one of the largest child murder inquiries the region had ever seen. They canvassed the neighborhood, went door to door, and interviewed over 1,000 local children. Detectives were desperate for any clue, any detail that might explain who could commit such a crime. Very quickly, suspicion began to circle back toward Mary Bell and her companion, 11-year-old Norma Bell. Detectives had noticed something about Mary in the days after Brian's death. While other children seemed frightened, withdrawn, or confused by the news of a local boy being killed, Mary appeared almost energized. She hung around the search areas, asking strange questions, inserting herself into conversations. At Brian's funeral, while the rest of the neighborhood lined the street in grief, Mary's behavior stood out like a flashing beacon. Witnesses later described her laughing, rubbing her hands together, and staring intently as the small white coffin was carried past. It wasn't the nervous tittering of a child who didn't understand death. It looked like pleasure, like satisfaction. Police began to take a closer look. When they questioned Mary and Norma, the two girls contradicted themselves repeatedly. Norma, who was less intelligent and more easily influenced, began to falter under pressure. She eventually admitted she had been present when Brian was killed but insisted that it was Mary who had strangled him. Detectives already suspected as much. The carving of the letter M on Brian's stomach seemed like a signature, brazen, taunting, and chillingly personalized. In August 1968, just weeks after Brian's murder, both Mary and Norma were arrested. The news stunned Newcastle. Two little girls, one 11, the other 13, accused of murdering not one, but two small children. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Parents who had let their children play freely in the back alleys of Scotswood now clutched them tight. No one could make sense of it. But as investigators dug deeper, the picture became clearer. This wasn't a case of childish pranks gone wrong. Mary Bell was a calculating, manipulative killer, and she had dragged Norma into her orbit. In December 1968, barely 6 months after the murders, Mary Bell and her friend Norma stood before Newcastle Assizes. The court was packed. Reporters crammed into the gallery, sketch artists captured every detail, and anxious parents came to watch the trial of two little girls accused of killing two even smaller children. Both girls were just 11 years old. They sat in the dock, dwarfed by the heavy wooden benches around them, looking less like dangerous criminals and more like ordinary school children who should have been in class instead of on trial for murder. That contrast alone unsettled everyone. From the very beginning, prosecutors painted two different portraits. Norma was described as impressionable, simple, and easily manipulated. Teachers and neighbors said she followed others, not led. She was, in the eyes of the jury, a hanger-on, a child swept up in something darker than she could comprehend. Mary, however, was different. The prosecution argued she was the driving force. Cold, calculating, and manipulative, she seemed to take pleasure in control. Evidence presented in court showed how she lured both Martin Brown and Brian Howe away from safety, how she played with the crime scenes afterward, and even how she taunted grieving families with cool remarks. To better understand what made Mary tick, the psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate her. Their conclusions were chilling. Each one agreed she showed signs of what they called psychopathic personality disorder. At only 11 years old, Mary was already described as manipulative, prone to sudden violent outbursts, and entirely lacking in remorse. One doctor told the court she had a flattened effect, meaning she seemed disconnected from normal emotions. In the courtroom, witnesses saw it too. As family members of the victims gave testimony, Mary often sat motionless, staring at them without expression. Other times she tilted her head, almost curious. And occasionally, most disturbingly, she appeared amused, as if she were listening to a story, not being tried for the deaths of two little boys. Reporters later wrote that she seemed to treat the trial like a performance. She was a child in years but not in behavior. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, the decision wasn't straightforward. They struggled with how to judge an 11-year-old who clearly understood what she had done but lacked the moral compass or empathy to grasp its full horror. In the end, they delivered a compromise. Mary was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma, by contrast, was acquitted and walked free. The judge, Justice Cusack, didn't mince words about the girl who stood before him. He called Mary a grave danger to other children and ordered that she be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, a rare sentence in English law that meant indefinite imprisonment with no fixed release date. The state would decide how long she stayed behind bars. At first, Mary was placed in Red Bank Secure Unit in Lancashire, an institution designed for troubled youths. There, she lived among both boys and girls, many older than her, many with violent pasts of their own. Staff noted that Mary adapted quickly. She was intelligent, articulate, and capable of charming authority figures when she wanted to. But beneath that surface, her manipulative streak persisted. Through the 1970s, Mary was moved between several secure institutions. She spent time in psychiatric facilities and later in open prisons as she grew older. Records show she sometimes thrived in structured environments, showing promise in education and arts. But her underlying issues never fully disappeared. In 1977, she briefly escaped from one of the open prisons she had been transferred to. The story made national headlines, not only because a convicted child killer was on the run, but because she had escaped with another inmate and, for a short time, disappeared into the general public. She was recaptured after only a few days, but the incident underscored how controversial her eventual release would be. Finally, in 1980, after serving 12 years, Mary Bell was deemed ready to re-enter society. She was just 23 years old. Officials granted her release on license, meaning she could leave prison but would remain under supervision. To protect her from the inevitable media firestorm, she was given a new identity and allowed to start life over. The public reaction was explosive. Many believed she should never have been freed, pointing to the sadistic nature of her crimes. But others argued that she was a child when she committed them, shaped by years of abuse, neglect, and trauma. In their view, her imprisonment had been about rehabilitation, not lifelong punishment. Mary slipped out of sight, vanishing into anonymity under her new name. For a while, she managed to live quietly, but her story was far from finished. Years later, she would resurface in newspapers again, not for new crimes, but because her past refused to stay buried. After her release, Mary Bell tried to disappear into anonymity. For a while, she succeeded. She moved frequently, changed addresses, and kept her circle of acquaintances small. But in 1984, just 4 years after leaving prison, she gave birth to a daughter. For over a decade, that little girl grew up in complete innocence, having no idea that her mother had once been one of Britain's most infamous child killers. That fragile anonymity collapsed in 1998. Mary, then in her early 40s, agreed to cooperate with a journalist on a book about her life. The book, Cries Unheard, was meant to explore her childhood, her crimes, and her rehabilitation. But when news of the book broke, public outrage exploded. Headlines screamed that a child killer was being paid for her story. Protesters called it blood money. Politicians demanded inquiries. Worse still, reporters managed to track down Mary and her daughter, exposing their location. The girl, then a teenager, suddenly learned who her mother really was, not the quiet, protective woman she thought she knew, but the infamous Tyneside Strangler. Crowds and paparazzi surrounded their home. At one point, Mary and her daughter had to flee under police protection, moving safe house to safe house like fugitives. The situation grew so dire that the courts intervened. In a landmark ruling, Mary Bell and her daughter were granted lifelong anonymity, protected under injunctions usually reserved for high-profile witnesses. Later, when her daughter had a child of her own, the courts extended that anonymity to her grandchild as well. Their new identities remain secret to this day. Still, the controversy never really died down. Every few years, tabloids tried to pierce the veil of secrecy, sparking fresh outrage. To some, Mary Bell had paid her debt and deserved privacy to rebuild her life. To others, the idea of her living freely, a mother, even a grandmother, felt like an injustice too heavy to accept. Her case has become more than just a crime story. It's a touchstone in debates about childhood criminality, rehabilitation, and whether society can ever truly forgive a killer who was, herself, a child. Psychologists and criminologists continue to argue. Some believe Mary Bell was born with psychopathic tendencies, incapable of empathy, wired for manipulation and violence from the start. Others see her as a tragic product of her upbringing. Her mother, Betty, was known for cruelty, neglect, and rumored attempts on Mary's life. With that kind of childhood, some experts argue, violence was almost inevitable. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the real answer may never be known. What remains certain is this: in the late 1960s, in a crumbling corner of Newcastle, an 11-year-old girl strangled 2 small children in her own neighborhood. She carved her initials into a victim's body, laughed at funerals, and taunted grieving parents, then grew up, walked free, and lived long enough to hold her own child in her arms. Mary Bell is no longer the wide-eyed little girl who shocked the world in 1968. She is an old woman now, hidden behind layers of legal protection and secrecy. But the memory of her crimes lingers, an eerie reminder that even a child can bring unimaginable darkness into the world. In the 1990s, you couldn't turn on a TV in Britain without seeing Jill Dando. She wasn't just a presenter, she was the presenter. If you woke up early, there she was on breakfast news. If you wanted travel inspiration, she was guiding you through the sun-soaked beaches on holiday. And if you tuned into Crime Watch, she was delivering serious, sometimes chilling appeals with the same calm authority that made millions of viewers trust her. She had that rare quality, the ability to move effortlessly between worlds. One moment, she could be laughing with a celebrity guest, the next she could be delivering a plea about a brutal murder. People at home believed her, not just because she was professional, but because she radiated warmth. It was why newspapers and magazines called her the nation's sweetheart. But Jill's life hadn't always been glamorous. She was born in Weston-super-Mare in 1961, a seaside town in Somerset. Her father, Jack, was a school carpenter. Her mother, Winifred, worked in a shop. Jill grew up modestly, in an ordinary, working-class family. Teachers recalled her as bright, diligent, and always smiling. She wasn't handed opportunities, she earned them. After studying journalism, Jill began her career at a local paper, the Western Mercury. She didn't start in front of the camera. She started behind a desk, writing local stories about council meetings and small-town events. But it didn't take long before her talent was noticed. In 1985, she joined the BBC as a regional newsreader. By the 1990s, she had become one of the most recognizable faces in Britain. Despite her fame, Jill never lost her humility. Colleagues described her as normal, a word you don't often hear in television. She wasn't swept up in scandals, didn't play diva, didn't treat anyone as beneath her. Camera crews loved working with her because she would always thank them after a long shoot. Even when walking down the street, fans would often stop her, and she would always stop back. Not with a rushed hello, but with real attention, as if their day mattered as much as hers. By 1999, Jill's life seemed picture perfect. Professionally, she was at her peak. Personally, she had just become engaged to her boyfriend, Alan Farthing, a respected gynecologist who would later become the Queen's surgeon gynecologist. Friends said Jill was glowing, happier than they had ever seen. She was 37 years old and planning a wedding, considering settling down, and even talking about starting a family. She had also recently bought a home in Fulham, West London, a small, pretty house on Gowan Avenue. It was quiet, lined with trees, far removed from the chaos of central London. To Jill, it was the perfect retreat. But beneath the shine of her public life, Jill was also very private. She wasn't the kind of celebrity who craved attention. She valued her independence. She valued routine. She valued calm, which makes what happened next all the more disturbing. Because on a quiet spring morning in April 1999, everything Jill had built, the career, the love, the future, was stolen in an instant. At around 11:30 a.m. on April 26, Jill returned to her Fulham home after leaving her fiancé's house earlier that morning. Neighbors saw her pull up, step out of her car, and walk toward her front door. The street was calm. There was no sign of danger. But within minutes, Jill would be lying on her doorstep, fatally wounded, the victim of a crime so shocking, it would become one of Britain's greatest modern mysteries. April 26, 1999 began like any other day in Jill Dando's life. She had spent the night at the home of her fiancé, Dr. Alan Farthing, in Chiswick. By mid-morning, she said her goodbyes, got into her BMW convertible, and began the familiar drive toward Fulham, where she kept her own house on Gowan Avenue. The late morning sun cut through the London haze. It was an ordinary Monday, the kind of day when people were at work, children were at school, and residential streets felt unusually still. Jill pulled up outside her home just before 11:30 a.m. Gowan Avenue was exactly the sort of place you'd expect her to live, quiet, tree-lined, and safe. It was the sort of street where neighbors exchanged nods and believed they knew who belonged. Jill parked her car at the curb, grabbed her things, and walked toward the blue front door of her house. It was a routine so ordinary that nobody would have remembered it, except for what happened next. As Jill reached her front step, a man appeared. Witnesses never saw his face clearly, and to this day, his identity remains a mystery. But what is known is this: in a matter of seconds, he closed the distance, pressed a gun against Jill's temple, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled. Neighbors later said they thought they heard a scream, followed by what sounded like a heavy thud, the sound of Jill's body collapsing onto the doorstep. It was 11:32 a.m. The assassin hadn't fired wildly. He had fired once, cleanly, at point-blank range. It was execution style, cold, Professional. Whoever pulled that trigger wanted to make absolutely sure Jill Dando would not survive. The street was still. No one saw the man run. No one saw a car speeding away. It was as if he had appeared, carried out his mission, and vanished back into the ordinary calm of Fulham. 14 minutes later, at 11:46 a.m., a passerby walking down Gowan Avenue noticed a figure slumped awkwardly by the front step. At first, they thought perhaps Jill had fainted, but as they drew closer, the truth became clear. Her body was motionless, blood pooled beneath her head. They raised the alarm, and emergency services were on scene within minutes. Medics tried desperately to resuscitate her, but the single gunshot had done its work. Jill Dando, 37 years old, engaged, beloved by millions, one of the most famous women in Britain, was pronounced dead on her own doorstep. In the 1990s, you couldn't turn on a TV in Britain without seeing Jill Dando. She wasn't just a presenter, she was the presenter. If you woke up early, there she was on breakfast news. If you wanted travel inspiration, she was guiding you through the sun-soaked beaches on holiday. And if you tuned into Crime Watch, she was delivering serious, sometimes chilling appeals with the same calm authority that made millions of viewers trust her. She had that rare quality, the ability to move effortlessly between worlds. One moment, she could be laughing with a celebrity guest, the next she could be delivering a plea about a brutal murder. People at home believed her, not just because she was professional, but because she radiated warmth. It was why newspapers and magazines called her the nation's sweetheart. But Jill's life hadn't always been glamorous. She was born in Weston-super-Mare in 1961, a seaside town in Somerset. Her father, Jack, was a school carpenter. Her mother, Winifred, worked in a shop. Jill grew up modestly, in an ordinary, working-class family. Teachers recalled her as bright, diligent, and always smiling. She wasn't handed opportunities, she earned them. After studying journalism, Jill began her career at a local paper, the Western Mercury. She didn't start in front of the camera. She started behind a desk, writing local stories about council meetings and small-town events. But it didn't take long before her talent was noticed. In 1985, she joined the BBC as a regional newsreader. By the 1990s, she had become one of the most recognizable faces in Britain. Despite her fame, Jill never lost her humility. Colleagues described her as normal, a word you don't often hear in television. She wasn't swept up in scandals, didn't play diva, didn't treat anyone as beneath her. Camera crews loved working with her because she would always thank them after a long shoot. Even when walking down the street, fans would often stop her, and she would always stop back. Not with a rushed hello, but with real attention, as if their day mattered as much as hers. By 1999, Jill's life seemed picture perfect. Professionally, she was at her peak. Personally, she had just become engaged to her boyfriend, Alan Farthing, a respected gynecologist who would later become the Queen's surgeon gynecologist. Friends said Jill was glowing, happier than they had ever seen. She was 37 years old and planning a wedding, considering settling down, and even talking about starting a family. The news hit the country like a shockwave. By early afternoon, the BBC had broken into regular programming to announce that Jill Dando had been murdered. Colleagues at Television Centre wept openly in the corridors. Viewers called into stations, unable to comprehend how their trusted presenter, the smiling face of Crime Watch itself, could have been assassinated in broad daylight. Even seasoned detectives were shaken. London had its share of crime, but this was different. Jill wasn't a gangster's associate. She wasn't mixed up in underworld disputes. She wasn't an anonymous target. She was a household name. Her murder felt like something out of a political thriller, the kind of hit you might expect in Moscow or Belgrade, not on a quiet residential street in Fulham. And the manner of the killing disturbed everyone. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't frenzied. It was clean, clinical, as if carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By nightfall, the questions were already flooding in. Who wanted Jill Dando dead? Was this a stalker obsessed with her celebrity? A disgruntled criminal seeking revenge for Crime Watch appeals? Or was this something darker, a professional assassination meant to send a message? The only thing investigators knew for certain was this: in under 30 seconds, on a peaceful London street, Jill Dando's extraordinary life had ended in the most extraordinary way imaginable. The murder of Jill Dando was not just a crime, it was an earthquake. Within hours of her death, the story was leading every news bulletin. Newspaper front pages the next morning screamed in black and white, "Who killed Jill?" It wasn't just that she was famous, it was the way it happened. Broad daylight, a single gunshot, no witnesses, no motive. The Metropolitan Police immediately realized what they were dealing with. This wasn't going to be a routine homicide inquiry. This was going to be one of the largest investigations in British history. They assembled a massive task force, pouring resources into every possible lead. Detectives conducted thousands of house-to-house inquiries. More than 2,500 witness statements were taken. Over 1,200 possible suspects were considered. The file on Jill's murder grew into stacks of boxes that filled entire rooms at Scotland Yard. But from the very start, the puzzle was strange. The way Jill had been killed suggested professionalism. A single bullet to the head, delivered at point-blank range, with no struggle, no robbery, no hesitation. It was the hallmark of a trained assassin. And yet, London wasn't known for contract killings of this kind, not against celebrities, not against television presenters. The first and most obvious possibility, Jill Dando had been targeted because of her work on Crime Watch. For years, she had been the public face of appeals that helped put violent criminals behind bars. Had someone she helped expose decided to take revenge? Detectives scoured old case files, re-examined names of convicted offenders, and looked for connections. Nothing solid came back. Then another theory emerged, darker, more international. Just weeks before her death, Jill had fronted a BBC appeal for Kosovar Albanian refugees during the NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. Some speculated her killing might have been a message, a revenge attack carried out by a Balkan warlord or his sympathizers. It sounded far-fetched, but intelligence agencies admitted that contract killings linked to the conflict had occurred in Europe. Could Jill have been caught up in global politics? The press fed the speculation. Headlines asked whether MI5 or MI6 were secretly involved, whether shadowy foreign hitmen had flown in and out of Heathrow unnoticed. For a public still reeling from the sudden loss, these explanations, however wild, felt almost comforting. They gave some sense of order, some sense that Jill hadn't just been randomly taken. But behind closed doors, detectives were struggling. Every forensic test came back thin. The gun had vanished without a trace. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers tied anyone to the scene. The street had been quiet. CCTV coverage in 1999 wasn't what it is today, and no cameras caught the killer's escape. The few neighbors who thought they'd seen something gave conflicting descriptions. A man, maybe in his 40s, maybe younger, maybe with dark hair, maybe not. Nothing reliable enough to build on. As the weeks turned into months, pressure mounted. The public wanted answers. Politicians wanted answers. The BBC wanted answers. Scotland Yard had poured men and money into the case, yet the investigation was stalled. Still, the professional Hitler theory never sat entirely comfortably. If this had been a contract killing, why Jill? She wasn't a politician. She wasn't wealthy in a way that would attract organized crime. And there had been no warning, no threats, no stalker letters. To investigators, it seemed odd that someone would hire a hitman for a figure like Jill Dando. But if it wasn't a hit, what was it? Another possibility, one detectives explored quietly, was that the murder might have been personal. An obsessed fan, a jealous rival, someone from Jill's private life harboring a secret grudge. Yet Jill was universally loved. Her relationships had been stable. Friends and family couldn't think of anyone who would wish her harm. By the end of 1999, the case was at an impasse. The grand theories, the Balkan revenge hit, the Crime Watch retaliation, the professional assassination, had all been chased down. But none of them had evidence strong enough to stand up in court. What was left was only mystery. Jill's murder had been carried out with chilling efficiency, and yet it left behind almost nothing for police to grasp. A single gunshot, one of the most high-profile victims in the country, and a complete absence of proof. And as weeks turned to months, and months into years, the unthinkable possibility began to creep in, that whoever killed Jill Dando had managed to commit the perfect crime, and might never be caught. For a year after Jill's murder, detectives chased every possible lead, professional hitmen, Balkan warlords, Crime Watch revenge plots. But the evidence just wasn't there. The investigation was sprawling, but also stalling. And then, in 2000, their focus shifted much closer to home. Police began looking hard at a man named Barry George. George lived just half a mile from Jill's house in Fulham. On paper, he seemed an unlikely assassin. He was unemployed, lived alone, and had a long history of mental health struggles and erratic behavior. But to detectives desperate for answers, he looked like someone who could have been involved. Barry George had a strange past. He was known locally as an eccentric. He had learning difficulties and epilepsy, and he often drifted through life in a fog. but his record made investigators pay attention. He had convictions for stalking women, indecent assault, and attempted rape. Neighbors described him as a loner, obsessed with celebrity. He had reportedly kept scrapbooks of famous women, and one detail stuck out: George had once posed as the cousin of the Queen's bodyguard in a failed attempt to join the SAS. The picture that formed was of a man fascinated with fame, desperate to connect himself to notoriety. To police, it wasn't hard to imagine him latching onto Jill Dando, one of the most famous women in Britain at the time. In May 2000, Barry George was arrested and charged with Jill's murder. The trial that followed was one of the most watched of the decade. Prosecutors faced a challenge. The evidence against George was thin. There were no eyewitnesses, no CCTV, no confession. What they did have was a single particle of gunshot residue found in the pocket of George's coat. That tiny speck became the cornerstone of the case. The Crown argued that George had lain in wait for Jill outside her house, attacked her quickly and without hesitation, and then escaped back into the streets of Fulham. They painted him as a loner obsessed with Jill, someone who had planned the killing for weeks, maybe months, but the defense countered hard. That particle of gunshot residue, they argued, was almost meaningless. It could have come from any number of sources: contamination in the lab, police officers who'd handled firearms, even transfer from the environment. One speck wasn't proof of murder, and beyond that, there was nothing. They also raised an uncomfortable question: could Barry George, with his mental health issues, learning difficulties, and chaotic personality, really have carried out what looked like a professional-style assassination? The killing of Jill Dando had been cold, fast, efficient. It had left almost no trace. Did that sound like the work of Barry George, a man who struggled to hold down basic routines in his own life? Despite these doubts, the jury sided with the prosecution. In July 2001, Barry George was convicted of Jill Dando's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For the public, it seemed like closure. The man responsible had been caught. Jill's family could begin to grieve in peace. But the doubts never went away. Journalists, campaigners, and legal experts kept picking at the case. The conviction rested almost entirely on one microscopic particle. Was that really enough to jail a man for life? Appeals began almost immediately, and over the years, the scrutiny only deepened. In 2007, the Court of Appeal finally quashed George's conviction, ruling that the gunshot residue evidence was unsafe. A retrial was ordered. The following year, in 2008, the prosecution tried again, this time without the forensic link. Their case collapsed. After 8 years behind bars, Barry George was acquitted. He walked free. Outside the court, George declared his innocence, but the acquittal brought little comfort. For Jill's family, the nightmare wasn't over, it was starting all over again. The only man ever charged with her murder had been cleared, and the question that had haunted Britain since 1999 was suddenly back, unanswered. If Barry George didn't kill Jill Dando, then who did? To this day, the murder of Jill Dando sits like a ghost over Britain, a crime that remains just as chilling and confounding now as it was on that spring morning in 1999. Theories have swirled for decades, and yet none of them have ever been proven. The first theory was the most obvious: a professional hit. The way Jill was killed, one single bullet to the head at close range, nothing stolen, no second shot, no hesitation, looked clinical, almost surgical. Detectives described it as execution style. To many, it seemed like the work of a trained assassin. But if that was true, the question was, who ordered it? And why Jill Dando? She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a spy. She was a television presenter. If she had been targeted by a professional, it raised far darker possibilities, ones that hinted at organized crime or even state involvement. The second theory was simpler, but no less disturbing. Jill was the victim of an obsessed stalker. As the face of the BBC, she was recognized everywhere. She received fan mail, and not all of it was friendly. Some of it was obsessive, even threatening. Police went through hundreds of names, people who had written to her, followed her, or appeared at the BBC hoping to see her. Could one of them have waited outside her house and struck when the moment came? Perhaps. But despite combing through thousands of suspects, no stalker was ever definitively linked to the murder. Then came the international angle. At the time of her death, Jill had recently fronted several high-profile humanitarian appeals, including for victims of the conflict in Kosovo. Britain had just taken part in NATO's bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. Within days of her death, tabloids speculated that a Serbian hit squad had assassinated her in retaliation, a warning to the West, carried out in London itself. The theory made headlines around the world, but no credible evidence ever emerged. Intelligence services dismissed it, the trail went cold, and still, the case grew murkier. Over the years, whispers of even darker possibilities took hold. Some suggested that Jill had stumbled onto sensitive information, that her work on Crime Watch had put her in contact with people powerful enough and ruthless enough to silence her. Others pushed conspiracy theories about cover-ups, secret services, or organized pedophile rings, though none of those claims were ever substantiated. They remain, to this day, speculation, fuel for the mystery, but not answers. What police knew for certain was this: on April 26, 1999, Jill Dando pulled up outside her home in Fulham. Someone was waiting for her. That person walked up, pressed a gun to her head, pulled the trigger, and then disappeared into a city of millions. Whoever it was left behind almost nothing. No weapon, no DNA, no clear witness. Just a single bullet casing, one faint scream, and a silence that has lasted more than 2 decades. Her murder triggered the single biggest investigation the Metropolitan Police had ever conducted. Over 2,500 witness statements were taken. Over 1,200 possible suspects were considered. And yet today, the file remains open, unsolved. For Jill's family, the tragedy was compounded by the passage of time. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, was left to mourn the woman he was weeks away from marrying. Her colleagues at the BBC, who had built their schedules and reputations around her talent, were left stunned. And the British public, who had trusted her, welcomed her into their homes every evening, felt as though they had lost a friend. Jill's death wasn't just the loss of a beloved broadcaster, it was the violent shattering of a national symbol of warmth, trust, and security. For many, it represented something much larger, the terrifying reminder that even someone so visible, so adored, could be vulnerable to the quiet cruelty of a single moment. More than 2 decades later, her case remains frozen in time. Police still describe it as a live investigation. Detectives have re-examined the evidence multiple times, using modern forensic techniques, but no breakthrough has come. Her killer, whoever they were, has never been identified. And so the questions linger, hauntingly unanswered. Was Jill Dando killed by a professional assassin with motives that remain hidden to this day? Was it the act of a disturbed loner, slipping through the cracks of one of Britain's largest manhunts? Or was it something darker still, something tied to secrets that, for whatever reason, have never been allowed to surface? The truth may never be known. What is known is this: on that April morning in 1999, someone stood on Gowan Avenue, waited for Jill Dando to return home, and ended her life with a single shot. Then they vanished, leaving behind one of the most infamous unsolved murders in British history. And Jill, the woman known as the nation's sweetheart, became a permanent figure in Britain's cold case files. Her smiling face, once a source of comfort for millions, now stares out from the pages of true crime documentaries, her name forever linked to a mystery that refuses to die.